Happy days. So we're live now on YouTube, and
Excellent.
the room's going to start filling up now anyway. So that's grand. So there's already a good 6 people in there. Good morning, everyone. How are you all keeping? Can you all hear us at home, or are we deaf? Or can you hear Bertie? No.
Hello. How we doing, everyone?
How's everyone doing? Good, man. How are you all keeping? Right. Get the old PowerPoint up and going. We're still waiting for that connection on my live side on my phone, and I'll connect that up with the
I'm
TV there to see if we're flying on the television. Sometimes there's a
live on
delay.
my phone.
Yeah, I've got we're live here. Well, the
Hmm.
ads are up and going anyway. My monetization is working for the time being. Would you believe? Did you, Bertie? Did you watch my video the other day on half dueling or something? I had
I watched the ones related to our talk
yeah.
tonight. I'm not too sure about the half
I
dueling one. No.
had I had a video up, lads. Would you believe this? And the violence in this video that I posted up was wild. And I was there with my own lads, and I was like, "This is definitely going to get demonetized and stuff." Not monetized. It's still up and going. How are you keeping, John? How are you
Nice.
doing? Oh, yeah, Michael's here in Clans and Dynasties. Jesus, we're
Nice.
pretty packed tonight, lads. I tell you that. I'll say
Okay.
something wild now, and I'll get demonetized in front of everyone. I suppose
I'll
we'll
try
get.
to be good.
I try. I suppose we'll get going. We decided it was a good idea to replace Michael. He was a bit too mental, so we decided to replace it with Bertie. So we have
Up the
Bertie
Munster
tonight.
men. Up the
Oh,
Munster men.
aye. We're not having Ulstermen on this chat anymore. Like, they're gone.
Yeah.
We
It's
decided it
time
was for
for a
the
new
best.
dawn. We're getting rid of that dynasty.
We really did. We thought it was for the best just to get rid of Michael. So yeah, tonight I'm with Bertie, and Bertie's got an old fancy book out, which is The Forgotten Prince, where you're not covering Brian Brew per se, are you, Bertie? In the book.
It's actually the Battle of Clontarf. So
Hmm.
it literally is the couple of days around the Battle of Clontarf. So it's Brian in in his tent, obviously the night beforehand, and then obviously what happens afterwards.
Hmm.
But it's kind of based around three characters. Donica is actually the protagonist, his son that survives the Battle of Clontarf.
Yeah.
So and Brody of Man as well. So yeah,
Hmm.
it's kind of around that time frame.
Yeah, because as you said there, his sons are always forgotten, and they're the ones who actually take over after him as well. Like, so yeah, it's absolutely fascinating book, lads, and I can't highlight enough. It's definitely one to definitely put on the old mantelpiece anyway, and give an old read as well,
Yeah,
especially from a completely different interpretation. Like, because all the books, especially around what was it 2014, a few years back when Brian Brew books were coming out like there was no tomorrow. Like obviously we'll be elaborating on Sean Duffy's book and everything like, but they're mostly always fixated around Brian Boru, and yet his
yeah,
sons, like people even forget. You made a very good point as well, is that people really do forget that Brian Boru, he wasn't the first over king of Ireland, and he sure wasn't the last over king. And in fact, his sons actually take over after him, and they
yep,
run Ireland.
yep.
So it's great that your book elaborates. This book here, it's not so much fixed on his reign so far. It kind of mostly revolves
No,
around
it's a bit.
Clontarf.
It's the start of a trilogy.
Yeah.
So it's going to be I'm going to tell Donica's story from the Battle of Clontarf until he's dead, buried in Rome,
Mm.
and then I'm going to go back and do Brian Boru's story. I'm going to do a trilogy there as well because I'm kind of coming from the filmmaking world, but like it's so hard to make films, especially this at that level. So I'm going to write the books first and
Yeah. Yeah.
see what happens.
It sounds like
You
a good
know, but
idea to be honest.
Clans and Dynasties, it says having a go at us here in the chat. He's saying Ulster says, "Come at me, bro."
Oh, we're looking forward to that one, especially from
Oh, that's
Michael's
it.
different interpretation. Like, because Michael disagrees with my interpretation as well of Brian Brew, so he'll be disagreeing with both of our interpretation of Brian Brew tonight. That's for sure.
Ah,
Especially
sure. I
against two
wouldn't expect any
Munstermen.
different from an Ulster man.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah.
Um, so before we get into the meat of things, I just want to cover the background of what's going on politically in Ireland, because the problem is, Bertie, this is the problem I always have, and you're probably the same as well. where people, when they're doing the background to Brian Brew, they always give like 793, the start of the Viking Age, and then they go as far as around 850, and then you just skip everything and
Mm.
go straight to Brian Brew.
Yeah.
And the problem I have with that is that people then have this understanding that one minute you have these raiders coming in from Scandinavia, burning the monastic settlements, and then you have Brian Brew who's fighting to save the monastic settlements, and it's like, whoa, Jesus Christ, there's so much to fill in
Yeah.
there, do you know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm just gonna give a little background and skip right ahead up to around 918, because at this point in 918, the Vikings they've already come over from Norway and Denmark and stuff. They've already come down into Ireland, and they've already started burning all of the monastic settlements that are around the area. They've kind of brought the golden age of Ireland, the age of golden literature, to an end. And what we have then is we have the Vikings who are starting to somewhat settle down, and then we have, as we were saying earlier, Turgis comes in at one stage, and he's battered. You know, he comes in, he tries getting into a fight with the Ullid batter
Yeah.
Turgis, and Turgis is kind of the first major Viking warlord that comes in, and he pops in around 840, 850, and he starts a fight with the men of the Ulster men, Michael's Law. He gets battered. Then he tries making his way down to the Dublin area, and he ends up pissing off the King of Ireland at the time, the over King of Ireland, Mael Shocknall the First. And as you were saying earlier, like this is the point where he gets chained up, puts into a barrel, and then chucked into the river. He gets dumped out there by the
Yeah.
over King of Ireland at the time, Mael Shocknall the First, which is something you've highlighted a few times, especially with Brian Brew, because Brian Brew is, you know, the alleged over King of Ireland and stuff, but he's not the first one. You know, even when
No.
Turgis
No.
arrives, Mael Shocknall the
Yeah.
First is the over King of Ireland at the time, and he Mael Shocknall the First manages to get the cattle tribute from the likes of the Leinster men, from the Munster men, from the men of Connacht as well. So what Brian Boru is doing at the time, centralizing and stuff, that's very important. And on top of
Mm.
that, we'll elaborate, especially over on your channel,
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
23rd, of the definition of what Brian Boru is at the time and why it's so important. But when it comes down to the over kingship, I don't want to be doing undermining Brian Boru, especially because the two of us are proud Munster men. I don't want to be undermining that achievement, but at the same time, there was already over kings of Ireland, and
Yeah.
when
Plan Sinna was a fairly substantial one as well. Like,
yeah, that's
you
another
know.
nail in the head, like, and another man that
Yeah.
has no problems subjugating the men of Dublin way before Mael
Yeah.
Shocknall II, way before what was it called, Brian Brew pops up in the scene and stuff. So I just want to, with that background, I just want to then elaborate then with the coming. What we have, as you said there, Mael Shocknall the First, who subjugated Dublin. We have Flan Sinna, who subjugates Dublin. The Vikings are already a part of, or starting to become a part of, the wider Hiberno-Scandinavian world, where they're a part of the politics that are happening in Ireland. They're married into allying themselves, especially with the men of Leinster. They have a very close relationship with the men of Leinster, even with the Flan Sinna's period, and it's the same with the men of the Southern Nail and the men of the Northern Nail as well, especially the Kennel Owen, where they have those marriage alliances. They're fostering their children now, and they're adopting children as well into their own clan. So those relationships are built up there. So by the time we get to the Hiberno-Scandinavians who come back in, they have a grievance with Niall Glundov. They end up killing Niall Glundov in the Battle of Isle Bridge, and then straight away they support the Southern Nail, Donnacha's claim to the over kingship of Ireland. So they're not usurping the over kingship of Ireland. Straight away they have that relationship built with the House of Leinster. They have that relationship built with the Southern Nail, and then straight away. So they're not fighting two wars. Sitrick Emer isn't fighting a massive grand campaign in Ireland, but at the same time they are fighting massive grand campaigns in England. And we can see that when in around 919 then, with the Irish Vikings, the Hiberno-Scandinavians, then the men of Dublin, as they're referred to in the annals. In the annals, they are referred to as the men of Dublin. They do then push into Jorvik, and they manage to capture Jorvik. And then for a good few years, then resources are put in from the Ustmen, with the Ustmen Anglo-Saxon wars of York, between 918 all the way up to 951, which is years of fighting between
Mm.
the Hiberno-Scandinavians and their Gaelic allies, who are fighting in Jorvik to get that control against the Norwegians, the likes of Eric Bloodaxe, and also against the men of Wessex, the Anglo-Saxons, as they slowly but surely start to recapture their territories and stuff. So I just want to highlight that, because that's kind of something that we
Mm.
constantly seem to forget, is that kind of broader idea, that the age of the Vikings going in and burning the Irish monastic settlements, that's long gone. And
Yeah.
it's something that people seem to forget over and over and over again, is the fact that this is 200 years. By the time we get up to Clontarf, so much has happened on the island of Ireland. Um, and I'll in a bit there, I'll hand it over to you, Bertie, and I'll let you elaborate on,
Yeah.
Brian Brew himself and his birth and
Take your
stuff.
time.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. But I just want to highlight as well is that, as I was saying there, Flann Sinna's son, Donica, has taken over, and he actually marries Brian Brew's
Mm.
sister, and builds up a relationship between the Dalcash. But weirdly enough, and there's a lot of arguments why he did this, but he actually then turns around and says that Brian Brew's sister was committing adultery. She was allegedly cheating on him, so he has her hung. Some academics would maybe she did, maybe she didn't. Some people would argue that maybe it was done politically. Maybe he wanted to build up a relationship with another to it and stuff. That's something that's quite interesting, and definitely a conversation people need to elaborate on,
Yeah.
especially
I
with the
definitely
wider
get into that
politics.
as well.
Mm.
I definitely get into that in my notes as well. That there definitely was a kind of a connection between the Dalcash and the High Kings, because it's to do with the Oanoks trying to kind of weaken the
Mm.
Oanoks. But we can get into that in a while.
Oh yeah, the Onakda. Yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be a good idea
Yeah.
as well when you cover what was it called? Brian Brew's death. Sorry, Brian Brew's birth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I just
It's
want
the
to
same
highlight
year.
stuff.
So
Yeah,
Brian Brew was born the same year Orla was hanged. It's just so weird. Like
yeah.
the kind of, I mean, it would have been a horrible time in the Dalcassian clan
Mm,
when you're just developing this relationship with the Overking, the
yeah,
High King, and like your your sister is, or like your daughter is hanged by the High King. It would
yeah,
have been weird, you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Just quickly looking over the comment section there, lads. Um,
Yeah.
what was it called? Yeah, 100% right. And I just want to highlight as well is that what was it called? Amlad Curon, who was king of Dublin at the time, as we were saying there, that there was a relationship going on between the men of Dublin and Jorvik at the time. Sorry, not Jorvik. As they were at war with Jorvik, the Anglo Saxons and stuff, they're building relationships with the other Tuatha in Ireland. And as you can see there, he's married to the King of Leinster's daughter, who's a very, very, very important character. Um,
Mm.
she's definitely going to be somebody who we're going to elaborate on again and again and again. But I just want to highlight as well is that fact he's not fighting Omlev Kuron, who does most of the fighting, this Hiberno-Scandinavian war that's happening in England at the time, the north of England, against the Anglo-Saxons and against the Norwegian Vikings. He's not at war with Ireland. He's building a very, very healthy relationship in Ireland. He's marrying the what was it called, the King of Leinster's daughter. And for a while between 919 and 940, there's kind of a breakdown in the tributes that are happening in Ireland, and it's not just Dublin who's not paying tribute at the time. There's a lot of tutors at the time who are not paying their tributes against Donegal because of the strange relationship that's going on politically in there. But once that's reestablished around 940, Dublin isn't turning around and saying, hey, we're not paying our tax this year. No, no. They rock
Mm.
up for the assemblies. They're paying their tribute. They're paying their tax. So although they're at war with the Wessex, the kings of England and stuff. Well, people who claim to be kings of England, and they're at war with the Norwegians, the likes of Eric Bloodaxe and stuff. They're not at war with the Irish. They play their political skirmishes. You know, they're allying themselves, as we highlight here. The king of one of the later kings of what was it called? The Over Kings of the Enel is ambushed in 954 with the men of Dublin and the men of Leinster. And I highlight the fact with the men of Leinster. So they are playing the political game. This isn't a thing of them coming in there and playing innocent dubs. They are, in fact, ambushing the Over King, allying themselves to the Northern Enel. They're playing the political game inside of there. And it's something that needs to be highlighted, that when we do see the men of Dublin have killed the men of Munster, or they have killed the men of the Enel and stuff, they're doing it other Irish kings. So they're doing it politically. It's not a case of the Irish Vikings versus everyone else. There's a lot of stuff going on in the wider political picture. Just going on to Wayne's comment there, did the Onachta join with Brian after he beat them against the Norse? Yeah, once he subjugated Cashel, he does bring a lot of the men of Munster into his subjugation, and makes like that. That's pretty much, in my opinion. Maybe Bert, you will disagree with me on this one,
Yeah,
but he does bring in a lot of the men of Munster into his military
yeah,
force at the
yeah,
time. Mm,
yeah, yeah. Like we'll definitely cover that as we go through, definitely for sure, because it's a long kind of process. Because the Onox were the kings of Munster for a long time. You know what I mean? So it wasn't just on the national stage that Brian was seen as a usurper. It was
mm,
actually within the provincial stage as well, you know. But
yeah,
that's something we'll definitely cover. There wasn't much left of the Onox by the time Brian was finished with them, to be honest, in terms of power.
yeah.
But we'll cover that soon. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think that's pretty much all I need to really cover with the background. And the reason why I highlight this background is just to show that, hey, look, we're not dealing with the early Viking age between the year, like, that was the year 793 all the way up to
mm,
850. 100 years have gone by now. That would literally do the comparison of the First World War, and comparing what's happening in the First World War
yeah,
to the politics that's happening right now with Trump. You know,
yeah,
and
yeah,
just to highlight that, we now have what was it, Umlav Kieran, who is king of Dublin, and he has a very, very, very healthy relationship with Leinster. Like, himself and Leinster are literally like this, and that you're gonna see that again and again and again, over and over and over again. We're not dealing with the Irish Vikings or the Norse Vikings versus the Irish. That's not what's happening here, and you can see
mm,
that politically. In fact, the Irish Vikings have now returned from a very well. Actually, they're actually, while Brian Brew is born, they're in the middle of coming to an end to a very long and very bloody war against the Anglo Saxons and against the Norwegian kings as well. So that needs to be very much highlighted in the background of the coming of Brian Boru. On talking about Brian Boru, do you want to like elaborate on the birth of Brian Boru, who he is, who's the Dalcash?
yeah. Yeah, and just something to say about the Vikings as well, because it's easy just to say Vikings as a
Mm,
label for this Scandinavian influence, like these people that were Norse Gael. There may have been some kind of the old guard, like
mm,
Ivar of Limerick, you know, the Olaf Curran. These were the last of the Norse, like.
yeah.
But so we'll get into that. But just to say that what Philip is saying is 100% correct and 100% important to kind of set the stage. But we do kind of say Vikings as well along the way.
Mm,
But a lot of the time we are talking about Norse Gael and people that have actually been here for quite some time in their settlements or Norse Gael
mm,
settlements. So
yeah.
look, on the birth of Brian Boru, yeah. So the birth of Brian Boru, it's in modern day Clare, the kind of region of Killaloe, so the townlands of Killaloe, right at the mouth of Lough Derg and the River Shannon.
Mm,
And he was born to a guy called Canatic Mac Lorcan. He was the king of the Dalcassians. So they're like a relatively obscure but rising dynastic group in a region called Thomond as we know it today, but it was actually that's a anglicized version of Tuamua, so like the North Munster.
mm,
But originally they were quite a small group within that in that kind of region because North Munster is quite a big region. But like they, as we'll go along, we'll see that they just literally started taking over the whole of North Munster and then eventually the whole of Munster.
Mm.
But the area where Brian grew up would definitely give him the elements he needed to create a kind of an empire as such, like because he was right on the highway of Ireland. So the River Shannon, like literally, is the highway of Ireland. It goes right up, all the way up to say the Northern Ireland border now, in terms of
Ah.
where it starts.
So
Yeah, it goes all the way up.
this is
Yeah,
me going into more of the pop history side of things. I just want to kind of dip my toes into the more of the pop history side of things right now, and
yeah,
just teary eyed. I just want to kind of put the teary out now. I want to highlight the fact that myself and Bertie, we're not university academics. We don't go into universities
yeah,
and teach this kind of stuff. So we're allowed to kind of dip our toes in and just speculate just a tiny bit. Um, but I
yeah.
do wonder, is this the reason why there's the Dalcash start to get very dominant? Are they getting a tribute, a kind of trade tribute going in, where trade is moving in and out of their area, and they're controlling the trade of
I
that area?
I definitely think so. I mean, think about the fact that their roots are in cattle. They were cattle lords. Like they
Mm.
became very wealthy over a period of time. Don't ask me how the cattle were kind of transported. I guess over land. Were they transported on boat? I don't
Yeah,
know. But
we
like
we
in yeah,
it's actually brilliant that you actually brought that up, because I have the same thing. If obviously you guys, maybe not everyone is aware of this, but I actually, on my Patreon, I do classes. I teach basic Irish medieval history over my class and stuff, and we've been speculating the same thing as well. There's a play on word on the roads though, so maybe they were using the roads, because there is roads in Ireland at the time. I should have actually had a
yeah,
picture up.
and hurdles and
Yeah,
fords and things like that. They did actually have kind of rudimentary fords
mm,
and bridges and things like that. It's
yeah.
amazing that they had these
Yeah.
things. You know.
So if you look
Yeah,
into the old Irish, it does have words for cattle and stuff. So it does a good indication they were using the roads. But I have a very good friend of mine who's in one of the classes, and he's a part-time farmer and stuff, and he was pointing out that's still very difficult to bring, allegedly, especially these assemblies, because some of these assemblies are in Clonmacnoise and in Tara and stuff. That's so far away from the Dalcash area and stuff. So to try to bring
yeah,
cattle up that far, it's still in the, for us, it's definitely something I want to bring, get a hold of a academic who specializes in the early Irish farming and all this stuff. Maybe Fergus Kelly or someone has the answer to it. But are they actually bringing all of their cattle to the assemblies that are happening up in Clonmacnoise, that are happening up in Tara and stuff? It's definitely something that's very questionable. Trying to bring it over to Cashel
yeah.
and stuff. So I just kind of want to put my, at least dip my feet into the pop history side and question, and even put out some theories and stuff of them transporting and moving cattle around the place, because that's an interesting one as well. Are they putting the cattle onto the boats and bringing them to
I
the
mean,
assemblies and
I mean,
stuff?
like they say that Newgrange was built by moving
Yeah.
stones on boats and things like that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like surely a bunch of cattle could get on a boat. I mean,
Mm,
there was one point Brian Boru, and I mean we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but at the same time it's important. Like at one point Brian did have a fleet of 300 boats going
yeah.
up the Shannon, like so.
Mm,
It's not outside the realm of possibilities that they were transported by boats. But
mm,
again, as well, the thing about this area as well around where he's living, there's plenty of pasture lands, like plenty of low level lands as well. So it's quite possible that there were some basic roads and these cattle were just coming continuously. Like
mm,
I don't know. It's a good question, but there's not. But in saying all that, there's no doubt about it that the Dalcash became very wealthy from cattle,
yeah.
and it's obviously very likely as well that they were at the mouth of Loch Derg.
Mm,
I mean, they control that, like, you know what I mean? And I guess maybe this is where a little bit of the attacks from the Vikings or Ivar of Limerick and things like that in Brian's life, or beyond
yeah.
before his life, that there was definitely attacks on his fort. There's no doubt about it.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Imagine these Vikings coming up, and then there's these guys stopping you. Like, of course, there's going to be attacks. you know.
Mm,
And I think this would have shaped Brian, like, and this would have shaped his life, from a formative perspective. He grew up in a time when there was these things happening,
mm.
where sometimes he was playing with his brothers, and then they would go off, and then they would never come back again.
Oh yeah.
This was a way of life.
Mm,
He had 11 brothers
mm,
and a couple of sisters. Now there's two or three sisters that they're not known about. Orla, we just talked about. She was killed by the High King the same year he was born. When
mm,
he was born, it's likely that two or three of his brothers were already killed,
mm.
but he still had around 6 or 7 brothers when he was born. And Kinetic was a very interesting individual. And what I've noticed about Brian is that he echoes a lot of his kin. He
Mm,
echoes Kinetic, and he echoes Kinetic as his father. He echoes Mahan or Machaman, as it depends on the anglicized version is a bit easier. Mahan, his
mm,
older brother, when he becomes king of the Dalcash, he starts echoing what they were doing on a bigger scale.
mm,
So I believe that Brian he was heavily influenced by his family. It wasn't just some sort of guy that just came out of nowhere with his own ideas. Like, I think there was so much influence on him as a child.
mm,
And also as well, he went because he comes from a noble family. This is something that people kind of might get wrong, is that, oh, he's like in an obscure family. They meant nothing. They were a noble family.
mm.
They weren't big, but they were nobles.
Yeah.
They were vassals to the Oanachta of the same province, like, but they were nobles. Like,
Mm.
they were, like, of no, like, aristocracy in a Gaelic sense.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
I
do you want to
think
jump in there?
yeah, it's just Paddy has an amazing question for you, and I seen that question off
Yeah.
Paddy, and I was like, Bert, you would definitely love to answer that one. You should definitely have a go off that one.
Oh yeah,
Paddy
Brian
says,
Brian Boru is not appreciated. He is Ireland's William Wallace. Why is not an epic film? I actually think I think Braveheart takes a lot of elements of Brian Boru's
yeah,
life, for sure.
oh,
Especially
100%.
the romanticized versions, you know?
Mm.
Yeah, definitely. Oh,
Oh, yeah.
definitely, Paddy. I think it's important to kind of go along and say, right, we definitely need a Braveheart version of Brian
Mm.
Boru, but we don't want to do the whole thing where we're wildly historically inaccurate.
Yeah,
Where I think it's important we could take elements of the one that was made afterwards. What was the Robert de Bruce's one that was made afterwards? I thought it was
there
fantastic.
was an
Um,
Outlaw King version that came out
Outlaw
recently
King.
for Netflix.
Out,
I absolutely love that one. But
it
like,
was amazing, right?
yeah,
They did the battles very well. It was really historically accurate. Amazing.
but the Brian Boru one could be even better, as you pointed out there. This isn't the end of the just because the early stages, because you easily bounced in there one, and point out the fact that at the very start I did point out that between 793 to 850, that's when we have the monastic settlements being burned, so on and so forth. And then we're not dealing with so much of that age at the start, but at this period, it doesn't mean it's the end of the Viking age. We still have Viking
No.
raiders coming in and setting
Yeah.
fire to villages, robbing villages, stealing women, and selling them in Limerick, Dublin, Waterford. We have Irish women who are being stolen by raiders who are coming in. Now, as Dr. Damien Bracken would point out with the annals, if you read the annals of Ulster, you read the annals of Armagh and stuff, they point out that the Irish were just as bad as the Vikings themselves for taking prisoners and selling them. In fact, we'll elaborate that a wee bit more with the siege of Limerick and stuff. That Brian Boru wasn't the great changer. He was bringing a level of stability to the island and stuff, but he was just as equally bad for the raiding as the likes of Mael Shocknell. What was it? Not so much Mael Shocknell the second, but the likes of Omlad, Cruron, and Ivor of Limerick and stuff. That he was into the tick for tat, where you raid my area, I raid your area. And also on top of that, not only are we dealing with Viking raids happening, but as you pointed out as well, Brian Boru and the Dalcash were mad into cattle raiding. So they weren't just getting involved with Viking style raids of, well, the tick for tat, you raid from my territory, I'll raid from your territory. They were also raiding cattle as well. So they were going in, robbing the
Yeah.
cattle, I'd rob your cattle,
Yeah.
so on and so forth. And this was seasonal. Like, we're about to go into May now. And at the start of May, there was a huge assembly that was called upon, where you would that was basically it. That was the start of cattle raiding season, and that start when the cattle would go to pasture. That would start at the 1st of May, and that would go all the way over to Samhain and Halloween, and that's where the pasture season would come to an end, and the cattle would come back in again. And this was a way of life. This fighting over the cattle, the going over stealing people's women during the Viking Age. Not so much acceptable as we go into the reform of the church and the High Middle Ages and stuff. But this exact period, stealing women, stealing cattle, burning people's villages and stuff. That was a way of life in the Viking Age. This is the Viking Age.
That was that was in fact written into the annals of Ireland many
Mm,
times. Like even say, for instance, like if Brian, like later on we'd be talking more about it, but like let's just say you had a little bit of a campaign into say Osrega or Ossory, and it
mm,
wasn't successful, but he had great plunder. So they would kind of say that, like, there was, but he had great plunder, like, but great plunder and spoils, and they laid waste. You know what I mean?
mm,
Like, obviously, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but this was like the economic warfare. Like, think about modern day businesses, like Facebook buys this company. It's kind of like that, where the kings, this is their economic,
mm.
political status, right? So you're literally going into a kingdom. It's not just about, it's the difference between, say, what we're dealing with now, and let's just say Vikings of 793,
Mm.
coming and literally just grabbing stuff from a monastery and just killing everyone. Like, there's no sense to it, kind of, only the plunder. This is more about, I'm coming into your land because I'm more powerful than you, or I'm going to show you how much more powerful I am than you,
Mm.
and I'm taking this, and then and that's who we are, and that's what we're about. Like,
Oh
you know
yeah.
what I mean? That's just the way it was. It's a
Oh
part of life, and like I think the people look back on these things with a modern perspective, and they kind of look at it as like, oh my
yeah.
god, great plunder and people stealing things, and every king was doing it.
Yes.
If you didn't do it, you weren't a king.
Yeah.
Like, it's as simple as that, and that's
Mm.
what I kind of get from Brian's life as well, is that he he kind of acted on situations in a very skillful and quick way.
Mm.
And other people kind of look at it and they kind of say, oh, he was taking advantage of situations. He literally did that his whole way through his
Yeah.
life. I mean, that's not just coincidence or taking it. It's literally, he acted because because he sensed the circumstances were weakened, and then he acted and he got stuff. And sometimes he failed.
Yes.
But that's what you did as a king. And that's why I believe he rose, is because people wanted that. They wanted strength. They wanted to see your clan moving forward. People then would start bending the knee to him because this fucking guy is going places. Like,
Mm.
you know what I mean? I'm getting behind this. Like, this sounds great. Like,
Oh, chalk
so
it down.
people have to look at it from a different perspective. You know what I mean?
Mm. Mm.
It's a different way of life. Nowadays, we don't murder. We don't go in and steal other people's stuff. We don't do this. We don't do that. That's fair enough. We get it. But
Mm.
let's not keep looking at that world with that frame of mind. Like, it's just silly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, it is. It is. It is. I just have one question there off Peter. I don't quite understand this one. Bertie, I wish I had invited the Ireland 101 to this interview. Learning so much. I will list
I
this.
know what this is. Yeah, I know what this is, Phil. Sorry to interrupt you there. That's Peter. Good man, Peter. Fair play to you for coming. And whoever else is here from the 101, Ireland 101, we all would know that crowd there. They do great service there for
Mm,
all the clans around the world. The O'Connor clan in the house tonight. Fair play.
nice, nice.
D O'Connor's in there as well. Fair play. So that's what that's about, Michal.
Oh, perfect.
Or sorry, Phil.
Oh, just grand.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for everyone who
Yeah.
rocked up today and having a chat. If you guys have any questions for myself and Bertie, we'll do our best to answer all those things. Obviously, the two of us are not academic level when it comes down to the
Obviously, when I'm talking.
yeah, 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 yeah. We're not teaching classes in University College Cork when it comes down to Brian Boru and stuff. So we'll do our best. And anything that we cannot
Yeah.
answer tonight, I will either, what was it called? Actually, we'll take a note of it because we're going live over on Bertie's channel on the 23rd. So on the 23rd, we're doing a big anniversary for the Battle of Clontarf. So any questions we can't answer tonight, I'll screenshot it and we'll send it over to Bertie's channel, and we'll have it answered. We'll have it answered on the 23rd. So if you guys have any questions for us on Brian Boru, That's from literally any question whatsoever. Actually, we'll take a note of the Battle of Clontarf questions and we'll actually answer it on the 23rd. We won't answer it tonight. We'll keep it for the 23rd. But
I'm
anything
not
to.
sure about that red hand or a red hand from Peter. Or is it a pink hand or a red hand? That could be the red hand of Ulster. Is he
Are
is
they
he is he
Ulster
going
men
up to
doing it
you later
again?
in the
Oh
hall?
Jesus Christ! Where's Michael? Michael and the rest of the boys there starting trouble already. Like red hands going up.
That's it.
Jesus Christ! I need what I should actually do is you've already got it set up. Is actually subscription. Once I get myself sorted with the tax and YouTube and stuff, because I'm on the 2 week
Yeah,
waiting list right now. Because I actually have it sorted. I hand up and go on for the boys up in Ulster.
do it.
Um,
Um, but yeah, something that I wanted to mention as well, because I
mm,
do get a lot of comments about this, about the Deshi tribe. So, thing about the Dalcassian name, that would have come kind of around Kinetic's time, just around Kinetic's time.
mm,
They actually were the northern Deshi.
yeah.
They were of the Desh Tuskert. So
Mm,
they were like a kind of a class of people that kind of went from Tipperary, Waterford, kind of clear. It's a big, huge group of people, but
mm,
they were more of the northern Deshi.
mm,
So they were kind of like a noble lower class of Irish people. They were kind of known as the vassals as well. But like that's something that the Desh Tushkurt became the Dalcash because they started doing this thing where like the fiddling of the books, having a claim to the kingship. This about Brian Bruce's clan and all that. Say, oh, they were fiddling the books as if other people weren't doing it. Like,
well,
you
yeah, like
and so they would have claimed the kind of, you know.
yeah,
So yeah, so like I just finished on this. Like so there's one lad there. There's a Tal Cash or Cash.
mm,
There's a guy that goes right back. They kind of link themselves to him. So
mm,
that's where the Dal Cash comes from.
mm,
So that would be their claim then to the throne. Now, if you go back far enough, they actually all come from the same people, the Oanukta. So that's what the Oanukta were kind of always claiming, that you've no right, like you've
mm,
no right to do this. So this is what was happening and concocting around Kinetic's time, and this is what Brian Brew would take over then
mm,
from
mm,
as
mm,
well. So it
mm.
was all kind of in the work as Brian was in his childhood.
Oh yeah, definitely. If we miss anything,
Yeah,
lads, if you don't answer our question there, make sure to post it back up again because there's a good few. There's a lot of movement happening over in the comment section, so definitely keep that up, lads, because it's amazing for my algorithm to be honest with you. So make sure to keep the comments flying in. Um, but anyway, regardless, the cattle business was part of that world, though. To right, like why attack each other and not just make money from the cattle? And were the cattle used for meat and to make things? Well, to be honest with you, that's where the whole thing of the over kingship comes in. You see, the over kingship still
yeah,
needs the king of Tara still needs to make you do what he wants you to do, and he's gonna do that by stealing your cattle. And as we go more into the High Middle Ages and late medieval period, cattle was currency in the countryside, in the country areas, especially up in the northwest of the island of Ireland. The cattle was the currency because hard silver, hard coins, to the regular person that was a part of the Tuat, that meant nothing. They couldn't survive on
nothing.
hard silver.
Yeah,
They couldn't survive on hard coinage. They survived on cattle. So cattle was important to them all the way up to the late medieval period. Cattle was currency. So to force a person into submission was to steal their cattle. If you stole their cattle for that at
mm,
the end of the season, once Halloween came, coming up to Halloween, the Overking would have came knocking. They would have had the Halloween assembly. He would have came knocking, and he would have said basically, "Can you survive for the winter?" And you would have said, "No, I can't. I don't have enough cattle." And he says, "Well, you're going to do what I tell you to do, and I'll give you back my cattle." And he'd be like, "No problems." And that's how it
yeah.
worked. That was the. It
And
was a
what,
game. It was all a game for them.
yeah. And some people might not know this. Maybe yourself, you probably know this already, but there was a lot of encampments. So on your
Mm,
campaigns, you would have to have encampments. So a lot of cowhide was used for the tents.
yeah,
So like so like there it wasn't just meat.
yeah,
You get cowhide and stuff like that. So that would have been that would it was pure currency. Like it was just a wealth.
yeah,
These things were all a part of your economy. You know
yeah,
what I mean? So. But look, I'll just there was one last thing I wanted to say there about no, not one last thing about kinetic. There's just one other thing I wanted to mention because we mentioned it already. Kinetic actually did strike up an alliance with the Overking of the time,
Mm.
Donnacha Dun, right? And
Yeah.
this was when the Orla was married off to Donnacha Dun. This would have been a big moment for them.
Mm.
But that was all to do with the Oonachta of Cashel, Callahan, their
Yeah.
king. So this was Kinetic's rival, the
Mm.
Oonachta of Cashel. They were the provincial kings of Munster. So this was showing that the Dalcassian tribe was on the ascendancy.
Mm.
And maybe the daughter was trying to solidify the political relationship between the two.
Mm.
And it obviously, in a way, it didn't work out, but it kind of worked out in the long run
Mm.
because what actually started happening was now the Dalcassians, even though he did kill Orla, which was a horrible thing, even in those times, like,
Mm.
for whatever reason, but he kind of elevated the Dalcash got elevated from that relationship.
Yeah.
And then because he did the Donnacha Dun didn't really look at Dalcassians as a threat because he killed their daughter, right? And they couldn't really do much about it, and he was focused on the Oonachta of Cashel,
Yeah.
that actually started rising Kinetic up.
Yeah.
So it was actually from there, because Donnacha Dun died a few years later,
Mm.
they actually started to kind of have a bit of a go off the Oonachtas then. This was when it all started to begin, the kind of the divide between North and South Munster. Tuamuma, Mumu, and Deshi Mumu.
Mm.
So North Munster, South Munster. Up until this point, that divide didn't really hugely exist. And this is why I was saying it probably did, but not in this way, right? And this is why I think it echoes Brian's story, because later on, as we'll see, he does become overking of southern Ireland,
Mm.
right? Le Maga, and then Mael Shacknell becomes overking of Le Cuans, which is so it's like this weird thing. It starts echoing through his life what his father was doing and what his brother was doing.
Mm.
So I just wanted to kind of mention that because it was interesting about that. Is there anything else you want to add there
No,
about that? Like,
no. To be honest
yeah,
with you, that's bang on. It does highlight the political relationship that was going on. That it's far more complicated. We're not dealing with a Irish versus Vikings. No, 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 no. That was 793 up to 850. Okay, if you want that fantasy, the fetish, and all that kind of stuff to do with that kind of stuff, look back to 873 to 850. We're up to the period now where we're dealing with more medieval politics. It's the game.
yeah,
This is why I love Game of Thrones so much, because it explains that here, okay, this is now big boy rules. We're now into the meat that is the High Middle Ages. We're starting to now go into the High Middle Ages, and with that, we're starting to have that transfer period of going from Vikings into the Crusaders, into all
yeah,
this kind of reform of the church and all this stuff. So we're dealing with big boy politics now, and with that,
yeah,
the men of Limerick, the men of Dublin, so on and so forth, they're part of this bigger picture that Bertie has just layered in front of us. So that it's a
yeah.
brilliant little thing. Just to highlight
And
as
it,
well,
yeah, yeah.
just to
Sorry,
highlight
go ahead.
Paddy's comment as well. Just to highlight the fact that at this period, everyone in Ireland is Christian. Okay, they're not a pagan. Paganism is another thing that's long gone. Paganism is gone in 550. In 550, we have the last over king who was pagan. He then moves the capital from Tara over to Clonmacnoise. And then Ireland from that point onwards becomes very Christianized, and that's the period of the saints and scholars. That's the golden age of Ireland, because it's at that same year around 550 that we have the likes of Saint Bridget, we have the likes of Saint Columba, we have all these big giants of the saints and scholars world in Ireland in 550. So Ireland is
Yeah,
Christianized at that point, and at that period, you have to remember it's a medieval island. We're in the medieval period. So you have a king, and then you have all these barons behind him. And in Ireland, you have the over king. He's the king of Ireland. And then under him, you have the kings. The kings are the barons in Ireland, okay? So just to highlight the fact that Ireland isn't like a special, rare, tribal, pagan community that's off in an isolated island off in the middle of nowhere. No, no, they're part of the medieval world going into the High Middle Ages, where we have the King of Ireland, the Over King of Ireland, the King of Tara, and then under him he has his barons. Those barons are the kings, and they're involved with the political fighting that's happening in Ireland. And just to highlight as well, as I said at the start, this is all coming out of the fact that you had the Ustman Anglo-Saxon wars that went on from 918 to 951. Okay, so this is all part of the bigger political wars that are going on as well at the same time. So Ireland isn't anything unique, and it's not. It has some form of unification with the Overking, the King of Tara, with his barons at the bottom, and it's definitely not pagan. It's not a pagan island. Even for the Vikings living in Ireland at the time, they've all pretty much become Christianized at the time. Sitrick is a Christian, you know. He builds Christ Church in Dublin and all that kind of stuff. And even himself, Omled Curon, he's buried in Iona, you know. So the two of them are not pagans. They're very Christian. And even Sitrick,
Yeah.
after this, he goes on a pilgrimage to Rome. So they're definitely not. This is not a pagan, isolated, 150 tribal island in the 10th century. So I just want to highlight that as well.
Yeah, there is a comment here from John Connor. I don't know if
Mm.
you've read this out, but Bertie, for anyone who has read for Morgan Llewellyn's
Oh, I
books
have
about
actually.
Boru, how
Mm.
close did you read that out?
I've actually read that book. I haven't read out the comments, sorry, but I have
No, but
read the
I
book.
wanted to make a comment on that
Mm.
because Morgan Llewellyn, yeah, I think I think she's an amazing author, and I
Mm.
thought she's done a great service for Ireland, to be honest with you, because her books, she doesn't just come at it from a kind of like a fantasy perspective. Now, obviously, there's dramatic license as well. My book is historical fiction,
Mm.
like, but she does mention a lot of her sources, and especially the one about the Battle of Clontarf, 1014.
Mm.
It's a beautiful book because she weaves fiction and non-fiction in together, and you can see that she's actually using a lot of the sources we use, Phil.
Yeah.
Like, and she uses a lot of the people that we would have read, like a lot of the books, the older books. So I think, of course, with literary license, but like she knows the politics, like she
Mm.
knows a lot of the stuff. She's very well. I think she lives in Dublin. She's probably quite old now.
Mm.
I didn't know it was a lady until I did research because Morgan Llewellyn, you think first it was like a man's name, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
actually an Irish American lady. She's been living here for a very long time.
Mm.
Amazing, amazing author. Probably one of my favorite authors of all time.
Mm. Oh, she is magnificent,
You
and
know?
the book is very very good. Now, don't get me wrong; the book is of its time, and since then we have, especially John Sheehan. John Sheehan
Yeah,
has done so much more archaeological work, which has really made, especially Claire Downham, who has her book out recently as well, where she's dived more into more recent work and stuff, especially around our understanding of what is a Hiberno-Scandinavian, what's the development of, Dubliners coming from being foreigners into being, the men of Dublin and stuff. Claire Downham has done an amazing amount of work, but that's all very recent work, and her book is a little
yeah,
bit outdated when it comes down to that kind of
yeah,
research and stuff.
yeah,
So just to pay
yeah,
note of that we have a lot more discoveries done since then. And I know people,
yeah.
I've been hearing people saying, oh, well, that's revisionist work and stuff. We have to do revisionist work. There's way more finds since the 1950s, the 1960s, and all those eras and stuff. And
And as
as,
well, a good man that attacks a lot of the bullshit revisionists is Sean Duffy.
oh,
He
yeah.
actually outlines a lot of. He actually dispels. There is revisionism that is, I feel, politically motivated. That's just my
Mm,
interpretation. Um, and he dispels a lot of that. So yeah, but we do have to like update the
yeah.
information as well when we know more evidence.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
one thing
yeah.
I will say about Morgan Llewellyn, she does tackle the topic of what happens after Clontarf as well.
Mm,
Now she does kind of go into a lot of old fantasy stuff, like, but at the same time, I don't know if you've ever seen noticed this, and it's actually kind of ridiculous that we don't know anything
mm,
really. If you look at it compared to Baru, we don't know much about the sons of Baru afterwards,
mm,
and we don't really know anything about the grandsons either.
yeah.
Like, there's not much on them,
Well, that's why
you know.
there's a very good comment actually on the comment section I was about to get into, and that's, imagine the amount of Irish literature destroyed in the past Yes, because there's
Yeah,
actually, we know at this point, I was talking to Kevin about this and I was highlighting Kevin's book early on. And I was talking to Kevin, and he definitely believes that Munster, Cashel, had a load of literature destroyed by Cromwell and Henry VIII. With the sacking of Cashel, because there should be way more literature there. Because if you think about it, there's an Annals of Ulster, there's an Annals of Armagh. Where's the annals in Cashel at that period? Like, Cashel should be pumping out literature like there's no tomorrow. Where is it? Where's it gone? So I definitely say that the annals of Cashel is missing somewhere. On top of that as well, we're getting an indication from both the sagas, the Norwegian sagas and the Icelandic sagas, and then also on top of that Irish literature, that there's two books missing. The two books that are missing is the Brian Boru saga. That's, we have no clue
yeah,
what that is, and also the Dublin saga is missing. So not only do we have a pretty good idea that the Cashel annals are missing, we also have a very
yeah.
good idea that the Dublin sagas are missing as well. So yeah, you're bang on right. We're missing so much information. So I swear, hopefully somebody somewhere has it hidden somewhere, or perhaps it's in a wall in a castle, or maybe it's hidden in a what's it called, a cranog or something. But Jesus, if that
Yeah,
pops out, it would completely change. We'll have to Bertie would have to quickly change his entire book around. But on saying that, I wouldn't
I
mind
know.
it, to be honest
I,
with you.
yeah, look, listen, it's we're all here for the truth, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And just something that as well that I wanted to kind of talk about as well, because we were actually mentioning this earlier on,
Mm,
is that not only was Brian's family on the mouth of Lough Derg, they
mm,
actually had monasteries quite close by as well.
mm,
There was Inishcaltra, like the Holy Island.
mm,
And what we'll see later on in Brian's life is that Markin, one of his older brothers who survives, it's just him and Markin in the end.
mm,
We can get into that later on, but he would have become abbot of that island. So this was Viking activity was rife
mm,
still, like in the mid 10th century. Ivar of Limnock became an absolute bastard in the lives of our man Brian and his ancestors
mm,
and his father, and he because the Ivar of Limerick kind of was the last. So I have a problem with people say that the Battle of Tara was hugely important, and I actually really love Mael Shacknell's battle there, and I really love
mm,
I really love aspects of Mael Shacknell's kingship, right? But some people will say, oh, the Battle of Clontarf didn't mean much
mm,
because the Battle of Tara dispelled the Viking power and all that. And I just kind of say, what do you think happened down in Limerick?
mm.
Like, you know,
Yeah.
like Brian Boru and his brother later on, when his brother became King of Munster, literally decimated Limerick
Mm,
and literally incorporated it into their kingdom. And I think the reason why this happened was they were absolutely assaulted by these lads, like,
mm,
for long periods, like, and I think over time they probably would have got better at kind of dealing with these attacks because it was so close to Limerick. It is
mm.
so close to Limerick. I would say 30 minutes on a good tide, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, you'd be up to the Lough Derg in no time.
Mm.
In no time from Limerick on a Viking ship.
Oh yeah.
So they were dealing with them all the time, like, you know what I mean? And it wasn't just Limnock. There was a place. It was kind of like it was called Tradree. I
Mm,
actually think, and you like Bunratty Castle as well. From
mm.
my research, I think Tradree outpost was around the Bunratty region.
Yeah.
And this was another Viking outpost. Also, Scattery Island. I'm going to be visiting Scattery Island this year with my girlfriend in May next month. Um, that was another little base as well for them. So they had all these bases, like, you know what I mean? And it
Mm,
was like it was a weird time, And I do believe that it was a time where it was either stand up and be counted or be just decimated,
oh yeah.
you know.
Mm.
So do
Just
you want
one
to add
thing.
something there?
Yeah, just one thing we are kind of haven't highlighted the fact as well is the fact that Brian Brew is very unique in the situation as well, and this will be something that will pop up a few times as well. Is the fact that Brian Brew was actually educated as well. I know we're slightly going over to delve into over and over and over again. Is the fact that Brian Brew wasn't just a regular brute. he was a pretty good brute.
Yeah,
We've highlighted that when it comes down to don't get me wrong, I think it's all justified. The men in Limerick are moving onto his territory. There and the Onocta as well. The Onocta are stealing his cattle. The men of Limerick are stealing his women. He has every right to be a brute and counter that. I do it. I think Bertie, you do the same thing as well. If someone stole your
100%.
sister, if someone stole your sister or your neighbor's sister that you've been friends with your entire life, or steals your the cattle is just banter, isn't it? If the Onoctor came onto my territory and stole my cattle, damn right I'd go over and rob that cattle back. Damn right I'd what was it? Do tick for tat with the men of Limerick. I'd still try to steal one of their women or try to fight with them and stuff as well. Absolutely no problems doing that. I'd do even worse, to be honest with you, if someone stole my sister. When it comes down to, but what I want to highlight is the fact is not only is Brian Boru part of all that as well, he's very unique in the fact that he actually didn't get a typical kind of war band education. He wasn't put into a war band like the Fenian war bands or the Curran war bands or anything like that. In fact, he was brought over to where Rosscastle is today, the island just
Yeah.
off of that, and he was actually given a really, really high education. I remember,
In Ishfallen,
yeah,
I visited a beautiful place,
mm,
unbelievable.
yeah. And we talked about that as well about 2 weeks ago on my live stream, where we were covering early Irish literature, which I have the live stream as well on my channel, so definitely go and check that out. But we were talking about the fact that that particular trade route where that island is, where Brian Boru got his education, was actually connected all the way over to Charlemagne's court. So at times he may have had people that were involved with Charlemagne's court call in, and not just trade in with literature that was going on, but also trade in with these massive ideas. And I think that repeats itself again and again and again. That Brian Boru was getting the education of a Renaissance Charlemagne court standard.
Yeah,
That was the standard he was
yeah,
getting. And you can see
yeah,
that in his actions again and again and again. And that's why Brian Boru's reign is so important, because you're not dealing with, I don't want to sound bad because the Over Kings of Ireland are really, really awesome, but Brian Boru was a Charlemagne Renaissance man, and
yeah.
those ideas were there in the background, but Brian Boru was the man who's pushing these ideas forward, and we'll definitely on the 23rd. I will definitely re-highlight all this stuff again. The importance that Brian Boru plays and his education plays again and again and again during his reign.
Yeah,
Uh,
the guy who taught him, and I actually am really pissed off because I was actually in the graveyard where apparently he's buried. Mail Sultan E. Carroll
mm,
O'Carroll was the King Olive, like literally say the chief olive of Ireland. He was like literally one of the greatest olives of Ireland that ever existed. Like if you look at
mm,
if you look into this, it's just he's so held in high esteem.
mm,
This was his teacher. This is what he used to he was on Inishfallen Island. This is where he was getting his education. It's unbelievable. So that's another thing, and we talked about this before the stream at a different time. We were kind of saying this like that we weren't this some insular world. We weren't like closed off. Like there was merchants, traders, and there was all sorts of news coming to. And I mean, myself and Mihal on our live stream before, we noted this as well. Like we like that's the thing as well from a modern perspective. Like, and I've heard you saying it in your own video as well. Like whenever we're kind of in a movie or something around this time, we're definitely going to be running around naked in battle, like
mm,
war paint and all a bunch of savages. Like these guys were learned men. Like now,
yeah.
obviously he's noble. He was a nobleman. So like he was kind of privileged
Mm,
as such. Like And another thing which is important about the place where he was getting educated was it was quite safe from the stuff that was going on in his own fortress because it was harder to get to this place, a Loch Lane and Killarney,
mm,
the River Lown that goes into the bay there, that's not a typical Viking place to come up. So he was he was insulated from that, from the terrible things that were happening. But also as well, he's probably coming back home and more brothers were killed. His
mm,
father was killed. He was called back and everybody was getting killed. Did this not have an effect on him? Did this not kind of steel, did it not give him some sort of steel? Obviously it did. Like human psychology is not something that just came out of nowhere with Freud and Jung. This was happening. We always had brain people. Of course, this was forming him. All of this
mm,
crazy stuff that was going on. this education, of course he wanted to do something about it. You know what I mean? Maybe not at that age, but it was just forming who he was. Is it okay if I kind of go on a little
Oh
bit about the
yeah,
folklore
smash
about
it up. Yeah,
Brian?
yeah, yeah. Push
Yeah,
around.
yeah, just to kind of lead into this kind of, there is a, like, of let's just kind of satisfy ourselves with a little bit of the folklore and the fantasy of Brian.
Mm,
There was this period of time where, there's not much written about him because he's only a prince, like, he's
mm,
not really anything other than just the son of someone, right? But there is this period of time where they reckon that, some people reckon, Roger Chatterton Newman, Morgan Llewellyn kind of goes into this. There's a few others that go into this, where they say he went into the wild huts of Clare, into the hills of Craiglee, Slieve and was taking his own mission on the Vikings. He was coming down with his band of men, his Fianna, and he was attacking these outposts like Tradri and all these other places. And it's not outside the realms of possibility. Maybe he wanted to do something more. Maybe he was a kind of a big teenager, and he said, you know what, Mahan, or whoever was interested, Lachlan took over for a while, but he died quite young, so Mahan took over. Maybe he wasn't happy with Mahan because Mahan was a bit more diplomatic, right? Which Brian learned later on.
mm,
He kind of learned to be more diplomatic later on. But in his youth, maybe he did actually go off into the woods and into the hills and actually start taking on some of these outposts, like, just almost like Viking attacking them. You know what I
mm,
mean? Almost like guerrilla warfare. And there's lovely stories written on that. And of course, it echoes the Fionn and the Fianna. But I would say, why not the fact that he was inspired by these in the courts? Maybe these stories were being told. It's not maybe, they were being told. This
mm,
was a part of our culture. Some people argue against that. They say the Fionn story came later on. I don't believe any of that, to be honest with you. I think these were being told. Maybe the fantastical way that we're being told is a little bit different then. But Fionn and the Fiann, written into the annals of Ireland, he's dead in the 2nd or 3rd century. But anyway, maybe he did do that. Maybe he went off and he learned the ways of the land. Maybe he learned the ways of the waterways, how things worked, how things were moving with moving with Ivar, what was going on. Maybe there was an element of that. Maybe Mahan backed him. Maybe Mahan, he didn't rebel from Mahan. My
mm,
point is that this education you're talking about and that he did get, and also the stuff that was going on around him, this was building some sort of, he was building the king that he was going to, that he was going to become. He was
mm.
building that person. And I'm very interested in that side because it gets lost in history. It gets lost because we're dealing with facts and figures. But when you really look at the evidence and you see what happened, you have to kind of estimate that this is what built him into the person that he was, you
Oh,
know?
definitely. I 100% definitely agree with that. Like, that he's not only are we dealing with somebody with the background of that Charlemagne Christian background, but we're also dealing with somebody who's constantly being impacted by the tick for tat with the Onachta, the cattle tick for tat that's happening seasonal. And then on top of that, we have the men of Limerick who are moving into Brian Bruce's territory. The likes of his sisters are being robbed. His neighbor's sisters
Yeah.
being robbed. This is a constant annoyance that's constantly going on, and he's there thinking to himself, grinding his teeth at night time, perhaps inside of the monastic settlements, going, "Oh, if I could, I bloody would,"
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I definitely think that the first opportunity he got when he left the monastic settlement to join his brother in support against the men of Limerick, I bet you he jumped on top of it, to be quite honest with you. Finally he can take
Yeah.
revenge,
Yeah.
for the
And it's kind of
constant tick for
horrible
tat.
that it's horrible that these girls aren't mentioned. I
Mm,
see Siobhan in the chat there now about war brides and things like that. Like, it's absolutely horrible that the only mention that we get of Orla, Mac or Injin Kinetic, like, is that she was hanged. Like,
mm,
it is quite horrible that we don't know more. Like,
mm,
and it's something that, because it's fascinating to learn about that side of the life as well. Do you know what I
yeah.
mean? Like, I'm not just saying that for virtual signaling. No, it's actually true because it would give us another side of the story. You know what I mean?
Mm,
And it would actually fill out the story more. So it's like, as you said, sisters being robbed, not just your own sister, kinsman's sister being robbed, other things happening, maybe even around the monastery around him. Maybe he was closed off, but there was other things going on there as well that was all soaking into his consciousness. And
mm,
then it's like later on, then, like, so something that we should mention by this point, we're kind of getting into later on. Kinetic, his father did die when he was 10 years old. there's conflicting accounts. It possibly could have been Ivar. It could have been actually a war with or a battle with the Oanakta. It's
Mm.
unclear. But at this point, Mahoon didn't take over right away. It was actually another brother called Lactna, and he was not much is said about him. But there's a very interesting fact about him is that during his reign or preceding his reign, he actually built a fortress up by Cragley's Cave, something that I couldn't find the last time I was there. I have to go back.
Mm.
It's actually overlooking. It's called Green On. It's kind of like this kind of old fort, and some people call it a fairy fort now. And I've actually, in fact, Cragley is where the home of the Banshee Avil lives. So this
Oh.
would have been the Brian Banshee, the O'Brien Banshee, but originally the Dalcash Banshee. And
Mm.
actually, she makes an appearance in my tales because she would have been a consistent presence in the clan, you know.
Mm.
So and especially imagine in these times, so many people were dying and stuff like that. She would have been so prevalent. And it's interesting that he built a fort up there. Actually, you know what I mean? It's kind of fascinating that he would have went up there. But anyway, he died 2 years later after Kinetic died, 953, and
Mm.
Mahan takes over, and he becomes an unbelievable king.
Mm.
People don't realize how good he was. And actually, I think, and Sean Duffy agreed. Well, I agree with Sean Duffy versus the other way around. Like Sean's the man that has done the work. I agree with him.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
he really emphasizes how Mahan is a very substantial king. Like he does actually facilitate and actually usurps the eunuchs.
Mm.
You know what I mean? He changed a dynasty before Brian changed a dynasty.
Mm.
You know, and this is why I'm saying it echoes Brian's life. Mahan's exploits echoes, and also as well by this point Brian is he's probably his second in command. No, it's not probably he was because
Mm.
Markin was already gone into the priesthood, the abbothood, or whatever you call it, and he was on his way to becoming an ecclesiastical superpower as well, which we'll get into later on. But Mahan is an unbelievable, capable, diplomatic, but also very good at warfare
Mm.
king because immediately he starts going raiding. So this is another misconception about the Irish. The Irish raided monasteries.
Yeah,
Clonmacnoise, for instance.
yeah.
The Irish raided monasteries, and we think again, oh my God, that's awful. How could the Irish do what the evil Vikings were doing? It's terrible. Oh my God, that's terrible. That goes against my romantic fantasy of
Mm.
the Vikings being. No, but this was common, and the reason
Yeah.
why is because it was political. Who was ruling that place? So at that time, Clonmacnoise, I believe, was it Congalock? Congalock was the High King at that time. I think
Yeah,
it was after Donogh had done. So Congalock, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So
I'm familiar.
Conglock was making a name for himself as a
Mm.
high king, of course he was. And he was in that area, so he was controlling Clonmacnoise. So Mahoon was making a bit of a name for himself by going up there and raiding Clonmacnoise. Like he
Mm.
was kind of saying, listen, we're and this is why I'm saying that earlier on I was saying that the High King did himself a huge disservice, or else his descendants a disservice, or the O'Neills a disservice by actually partnering with the Dalcash, because now the Dalcash are at a point where they're reversing things and they're
Mm.
actually starting to have snipes at the High King,
Yeah.
which was obviously after Donogh had done. So Mahoon actually starts consolidating and starts actually gaining support around the areas around
Mm.
the Dalcassian kingdom. So the Dalcassian kingdom is getting bigger and bigger. The Ivigintes below them, that was kind of Limerick area. The Corca Baishkan, they were kind of over West Clare. They started all forming the new kingdom that would be Brian's Dalcash. You know what I mean? Now,
Mm.
obviously, he did have rebellions and people having goes of him, but he would actually always keep them kind of under wraps, like
Mm.
So yeah, I think that's kind of I wanted to jump in again, but I think what I'd love to hear from yourself, Phil, and I'd say everybody in the chat would is like, let's just say like we're going to a battle, like so let's just say the Vigintes are after rising up against us, and we're going into a battle. Would it be outside the realms of possibility like that? Say let's say the main soldiers would be going in with a bit of chainmail on. Like there's kind of
Well,
misconceptions and things like that around that.
It depends now on the units that we're having. So we're very early on now, and we're talking about skirmish fighting, and because they like to be pretty light on their feet and stuff, you do have a lot of, as they refer to in the mythology side of things, the Fenian war bands, or in the literature itself in English, it's referred to as the Kern war bands. Most of the time, they try to go as light as possible because riveted mail and helmets are quite heavy, and at times they can be quite annoying. Like if you've ever had a helmet on, if it's not put on correctly and stuff, it will rock around the place like there's no tomorrow. So you have a lot of these Finn warbands and what was it called? Kern warbands who try to go as light as possible. They will even go barefoot. So you'll even see depictions of them in the Book of Kells of only having quarter length pants on. They'll have no top on, and they'll just have either the sword and buckle, or they'll have a buckle and a spear. And to most people who are not educated with martial arts, they'll look at the buckle and think, oh, well, that's kind of stupid. A buckle is just a small, it's literally fist width shield, and it's there for blocking, very quick blocks, very quick stabs. So they're very much martial art motivated. They're very much skirmish fighting. They're not going to be holding any shield walls or building any spear walls or anything like that. Their formations are very skirmish, very loose formations, and their main purpose is cattle raiding, stealing, kidnapping, that sort of stuff. And you see that during Kevin's book now that I actually give over to yourself, and I'll have to post up for the other guys and stuff. In the Finn cycle, it constantly has endless amount of references of them ambushing and killing people, and they'll even, like, for the whole tick for tat that was going on at the time, there's examples of them. They'll get into a feud with another warband and they'll say, we'll kill his sister, and they'll ambush and kill someone's sister. Like, these are horrible human beings. As you were pointing out, there's a lot of romance around the Fenian warbands, but if you actually look at the literature that's written at the time that Kevin has translated, these are horrible human beings. These guys are not very nice. They're also of, there's a misconception that they're of the levy low classes and stuff. No, they're not. They're actually of the high nobility. They're coming out of that, as we were saying, the baron classes. If you didn't own land, you would have financially not been able to afford to give your child the education and resources needed to get them that martial art education, of being able to allow them to go into campaigns that lasted from May all the way over to Halloween. Like, it's the Tuat families, it's the Tuat themselves that are paying out for these children to join these war bands for a long time. So they're not of the low class level at all. So the misconception that they're low level, they couldn't afford armor, they're too ignorant, no, that's not true. These are young fellas between the age of 15 to 25. They've just finished up their fosterage, which is their main education. They're now gone in to join the war bands between age 15 to 25, and after they're done, they come back to the Tuat. They inherit their land, and from that period, you'll see them take proper formations with the local Tuat. And these formations are proper shield wall formations, riveted mail formations, but these would have been more for battles. So for skirmish fighting, cattle raiding, kidnapping, committing ambushes, murder like that, you would have had the Fenians, the Kerns doing that kind of work. However, when it comes down to actual battles, that's when we see the rising of the levies, the very low level fighters who are, they just have the basic gambeson on. Gambeson being just a woolly armor. It's just armor that's constantly built up with wool. Then they would have a very basic helmet on. Those people then would have a very basic, spear. And then because of the way that the old Irish is used with levy, some people debate that they may have had either a wicker shield or a Viking a proper Viking shield. But they would have had a shield regardless to do the old shield wall with. And they also would have had the spear, so they could have a formation of spears that they would have advanced forward with. And it's the same with these noble classes as well, that they would have also had, the noble classes then would have done formations, and they would have had the full armor on, they would have had the riveted mail on, they would have had the helmet on and stuff. And with that as well, they would have also mixed up, this is a very mix and match period as well, they would have also hired mercenaries out of Cork, Limerick, Dublin, and these would have been either Gaul Gael mercenaries, Irish Viking mercenaries, or as the direct translation is, Irish foreigners. So that was the Gaul Gael mercenaries, which you would have most likely seen, or they would have also hired mercenaries from Iceland, that would have come down from the Orkneys. So you would have had mercenaries that would come down from the Orkneys into Dublin, into Limerick, into Cork, and they would have looked to being hired inside of those areas. Or they would have gone out and ventured for work, and they would have been Icelandic mercenaries, Norwegian mercenaries, Danish mercenaries, even mercenaries as far as Poland would have came to Dublin,
Wow.
Cork, Limerick, and looked for work for that seasonal fighting, because they knew they were guaranteed work from the start of May all the way over to Halloween. They would have been hired in Dublin, Cork, Limerick, and then they would have then done, if they weren't getting involved with battles, which is their main speciality, guaranteed lads would have jumped in and done cattle raiding. They would have done kidnapping and stuff. I know by the
Yeah.
book they would have, they were there to do battles and stuff, and that's what they were very, 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 very good at. They weren't as good as the local war bands, the Fenian war bands and the current war bands and stuff at cattle raiding and stuff. But guaranteed these lads were getting involved in there, because you can see that in the late
Yeah.
medieval period with the Scottish mercenaries, the Red Shanks and stuff, and them getting involved not just in battles, like they want to be there for the battles, but they were also getting involved with cattle raiding and any other stuff that was going on at the time. So I can guarantee these
Yeah.
lads were there to work. If you had a cattle raid going on, these lads would have put their hand up and says, "Hey, look, I'll give you a hand. Just make sure I get a bit of
Yeah.
payment at the end."
I
Um,
I definitely think as well, like it just goes back to the thing about the Braveheart Brian Boru thing as well. Just it's something you mentioned in the beginning. If we were to do these films, we need to do it from a proper standpoint. They were noble.
mm,
They weren't just like, like in Braveheart, that's a big huge problem, is that he's just a simple farmer wanting to raise crops. Like William Wallace was a noble, like you
yeah,
know what I
he,
mean?
he
Like
he
he was a
was.
noble.
Like
Yeah. And then yeah,
Brian Brew never served in the Fenian. He spent his entire life when he learned these formations. He learned how to fight and stuff. He learned to fight from a noble perspective. As in, when I say
yeah,
perspective, I mean with the riveted mail. He would have held. He spent his whole life learning how to do battles. He never, from my knowledge and stuff, he never got the education of skirmish fighting, of raiding. He don't get me wrong, he wasn't ignorant. He was actually very, very, very educated with cattle raiding, with those sort of raids and stuff, and you can see that time and time again. But he never, from what I've seen, maybe you can correct me on Bertie on this one, but he spent his time in his church. He didn't get fostered in and then join a war band afterwards. I couldn't find
no,
anything
no,
like
no.
that.
I think the romantic Fenia thing, it could have happened in his teens as a
Mm,
kind of act of rebellion or something. But the reality is, there's no real sources on that. I think that's
yeah.
just create a kind of a fiction. But the one thing the reason as well, I think it was important for you to highlight all of this,
Mm,
because I've been called out like saying, oh, when I've created some images and things like that, there might be a bit of mail, chain, like a bit of riveted mail or whatever on the warriors. And people go, they get crazy, like the Gaelic warriors never wore that
no,
ever.
that's not
Like,
true.
it's like, that's not true. That's not
Yeah.
true. And actually, I was talking to an IFTA award-winning production designer who's worked on like a huge amount of stuff, like, and she knows what she's talking about. And she was on board to do my Brian Bruce short. That's how the book came to be, through the film and the scripts at the back, all that kind of stuff. But she talked about how the kings, right? Let's just say Brian Brew. Now I know we're jumping ahead a bit, but let's just say
Mm,
whatever. A king that was kind of, the king was the ultimate commander. Like a
yeah.
lot of the time the king was behind the scenes, directing everything. For decorative purposes, they would have looked different, like to everybody else. So they would have looked more, they would have had their extra bit of armor on, their extra bit of thing, not because they were using it to fight, but because they were the king and they were decorative. Like it wouldn't have been as prominent or pronounced as what we know, like, but there were certainly, little bits of it. Like, now I
Mm.
don't know if you agree with that, but
Well,
that's something that makes kind of sense,
if if
like,
if you look at the likes of the Battle of Tara and stuff at this period, especially because they just came out of a big conventional war with the Anglo-Saxons and the Norwegians in Jorvik. So both sides, especially like as we were pointing out there, the Vikings definitely specialize in what I call conventional warfare, which is them holding the shield wall and the spear wall and advancing forward. But you also have the high Irish nobility who also have they're fully decorated. They're like, as you pointed out, Brian Brew was rich, and this man wanted to show off. So he would have had his own form. If you look at the Clontarf sword, for example, geez, that sword is highly decorated. Like, that was a sword to show off. He would have had his riveted mail on, very expensive riveted mail with the bronze at the very bottom of it, just to show off his wealth. He would have also had a neck piece around his neck, also would have been bronzed at the bottom. He would have had his helmet that would have been fully, if not the top part of it, which was being made of iron, the rest of it in riveted mail. Like, when you seen Brian Brew on the field, you would have known that was Brian Brew. Like, he would have been proper decked out, and all of his embroidery and all of his riveted mail and all of his armor as well. Like, you would have known that's a full mile away would have been Brian Brew. There's also an argument that Brian Brew was wearing scale armor onto the battlefield, that he wasn't just wearing riveted mail. He had that form at the time of full plate armor. Now, that's very, very, very debated, and I'm not going to say, oh, Brian Brew had scale armor on the battlefield, because I know there's people that disagree with that, and I haven't really gotten to the proper argument to what the scale armor versus riveted mail is. But some people debate that Brian Brew was going into the battlefields in scale armor, and it's definitely something I have to do further investigation into. And it's definitely something Connor from the Celtic Templar, he 100% believes that Brian Brew had scale armor going into these battles. So Brian Brew was very, very well educated into warfare at the time.
It kind of we just need to kind of get out of this black and white kind of view of history, like, where, like, okay, we know, like, that certain the lower class Gaelic warriors were wearing very light stuff, but it's not outside the realms of possibilities that the higher up you were, the type of battle it was, the more rich you were. Like, why wouldn't you? Sure, they already incorporated Viking technology. They didn't really. Am I right to say they didn't really fight with axes until the Vikings came along?
Yeah, that's very true. But as Colin pointed out, the problem is that a lot of people had a very arcane interpretation of Irish warfare until very recently. Colin pointed out that people were just kind of dumping Roman finds with Charlemagne finds, and they were just like, oh, well, the Irish were mix and match. They were mixing and matching, and that's not true. That was a very, very ignorant interpretation of Irish warfare. So our understanding now this year is that in the start of the Viking Age, in fact, the Irish were actually slightly more advanced than the Vikings because they had Charlemagne equipment. So what happened during the Golden Age of Ireland is that you had men of the monastic settlements who were going into Charlemagne's court, and they were in fact building a very, very healthy and good relationship with Charlemagne and his predecessors, and so they were bringing back this equipment back to Ireland. So when the Vikings arrived, that's why Turgis is losing battles against the Ullid. That's why he's losing against Mayor Shokinal I, because these guys are armoured out in Charlemagne kit. And that's why they're losing these battles. No, don't get me wrong. As you pointed out, the men of Ullid are quickly adapt to the weaponry of the Vikings. The Vikings are bringing... so they're doing their... at the very start, everybody gets into a formation. But what's very scary is that Vikings are bringing axes into it. And that terrifies the Ullid. Like, if you've ever been in this situation, I did living history for a good few years. And when you're dealing with the Dane axe and the axes, they're actually scary, man. They take down you're behind a shield. And the shield is the thing that keeps you safe. That thing's getting smashed up in front of your eyes, or getting pulled at. Oh boy, you're going to get scared quite quick, especially if your life is on the line. So they're breaking down their shield walls so quickly. But the Ullid like this. The Ullid are looking at this going, God, we need to get axes just like the Vikings are using. So the following season, they're bringing axes in as well. So by the time we get up to Brian Brew's period, this is a fully modernized military that takes on both Charlemagne tactics, their own tactics, obviously, of the Fenian, and also on top of that as well, they're bringing in that Scandinavian warfare in there as well. So Ireland is very much connected with the warfare. So at the very start, when Brian Brew is on the rise and we have this skirmish fighting going on, it's very light infantry. We have lads who can afford to buy riveted mail, they can afford to buy a helmet, but because they're quickly robbing, this is where the banter comes in, man. They're quickly going into Onachta territory and they're quickly stealing their cattle and bringing it back. you want to be as light and as quick as you possibly can. So
Yeah,
they're
that makes
taking
total
that
sense.
riveted mail. That stuff is getting dumped to the side, and it makes sense. That's why we're having literature where it says that they're taking it. They're not going into battle with armor on. And although the enemy is confused, the enemy is losing, and the enemy is not adapting. And so later historians are just like, oh, well, it's because the Irish are a bit stupid. Here, look, they're winning those battles. You have to ask yourself, why are they winning those battles? Why are they winning these skirmishes? Because they're going in very quickly. They're taking the cattle. They're ambushing. So the enemy chases after them. They set up an ambush. The ambush is successful. So
Yeah,
it's not that they're stupid. They know that they can move way quicker if they just chuck that riveted mail to the side, take off your helmet for a few minutes, and we'll quickly smash it. No, don't get me wrong. There's a good few accounts of. I'm not sure about leather helmets. There is accounts of leather helmets, but there's no fines to do with leather helmets. So that's very debatable. But there is thing of them saying that they kept their helmet on and stuff depending on the raid. But it depends on the raid. But a good few
yeah,
times you do have lads that take off their helmet, they're taking off their riveted mail, and they're quickly hitting. And vice versa, when they're raiding against the Vikings, you do have them taking off their riveted mail and stuff and going in, burning the settlements, kidnapping who they need to do. That's the skirmish fighting, the tick for tat that's happening. However, now that we're going into the likes of the siege of Limerick, the siege up in Cashel and stuff, and we're dealing with battles outside of Cashel and stuff,
yeah,
now we're dealing with lads, okay, we need to get into the formation, we have to hold the
yeah,
formation, and we have to push through. So they are now putting on their rivet. They're putting, first off, they'll put on the regular noble puts on his gambeson first, which is a woolen armor. It's, they keep putting wool onto it until it's nice, thick, and padded. And you can imagine that's great for dealing with arrows. It's dealing with sword slashes. That's great. Then we'll get the old riveted mail. We'll chuck the riveted mail on over that. Then we'll get our padded coif. The padded coif goes on over that, which is a padded helmet. And then we put our actual helmet on over that. And the actual helmet then would, on the bottom of it, they have these rings. The blacksmith would put these rings in so they then could have riveted mail to cover their cheeks. And that's very important. And you'll even have people put in Ireland, in the islands as well, because headhunting culture is very important with the Irish. They'll put chick pieces onto the side, so when someone goes to do a sudden decapitation, it stops the decapitation from happening. So they have their riveted
yeah,
mail that goes on in front of it. I'll have to get pictures on this for the next
mm,
weekend on the 23rd, because this is fascinating stuff.
yeah,
But I'll also put cheek pieces on the side as well to stop that
yeah.
decapitation from happening.
That actually brings us very nicely, perfect timing for the Battle of Solcoid. This is when things started really
Mm,
get going with Mahan, right? And his kind of big, you know,
yeah.
surge for the kingship of Munster, and this is where Brian Boru kind of actually rises as well in terms of his military prowess.
Mm,
So it's around 967, 968. This was a huge, massive, massive win for the Dalcash.
mm,
It was against the. It was basically the battle that ended Viking power in the area of Thomond,
mm,
Limerick, and its surrounding areas. Now there are kind of sources and things like that say that they were definitely supported by the likes of Malloy and Mailmod of the Oanox and the Donovans, Donovan E. Cahill, I think it is,
mm,
of the Viginti. But anyway, the point is that they were it was a pitched battle and it was likely thousands died, maybe not quite thousands and thousands, maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000, something along those lines. They actually say that it was around the Solo Head region, which we know of course from the War of Independence.
mm.
I think that's the first shot that was shot at the War of Independence. um there was this, so then this whole thing about, and I was interested to hear your point about the Brian not necessarily doing this kind of like,
Skirmish
skirmishes
warfare,
and things
yeah.
like that. Because I think I think you're right, because I think a lot of this is kind of added in and there's never really any sources on it. Like it's kind of like fantastical stories of like
Mm,
Brian, leading the Viking forces into the woods and all. It's like something you get in a movie, like.
yeah.
But this is more. It was actually a pitched battle because Ivar he was a self-styled king of the foreigners.
Yeah.
And of course, then the Cogag Gael Nigolach actually would go further and say that he was, you know, putting levy on everybody in Munster, and that he even, they were saying that he thought he was the king of Munster. You know
Mm,
what I mean? Now I don't know how far he thought, but he certainly was the king of the foreigners of the region, and he was a cruel enough as I said earlier on, the B word, like,
Mm,
and so the Battle of Solcoit was a huge turning point for the King of Munster uh, title charge, because he wasn't there yet. A
mm,
lot is the problem with this period as well, is that people wouldn't own up to the fact that he was essentially King of Munster, because really after Calacan of the Oonach died, Mael Maud, like Malloy, really wasn't a strong king. Like, he wasn't, even though he was technically the king.
mm,
But there are sources that, like, for instance, there's a book, King and the High Kings, by something, I can't remember the exact name. It's somewhere here. There's actually a book that just writes down 963, Mahon is the King of Munster.
mm.
But I don't know if that's technically true, to be honest with you. I think these battles and these things took place first
Yeah.
before he actually went and took Cashel.
Mm,
So something that we should note as well by this point, and it's definitely something that we should get into, because it's quite like the cattle thing, is the hostages
mm.
scenario. So this is a huge part of medieval
Yeah.
Ireland, and you probably have a lot to say on this.
Oh
And I
yeah.
actually asked Sean Duffy this when I met him in Trinity College, and it was like one of my main questions, because I couldn't get my head around it, because hostages were a kind of a political
Mm,
tool, right? Now I'll just go back. I have a little bit written on it here, but maybe it's kind of. But basically, in a nutshell, having more hostages meant that your status rose,
yeah.
right? And it all depended on what type of hostages you had.
Mm,
For instance, they reckon Malloy at this time, and even Duffy kind of writes about this, and this is why, really, was he really the King of Munster? Nah, it doesn't really look like it, because they reckon that a lot of his vassals were just giving him hostages just to
mm,
make his claim a bit more substantial, or his kingship more substantial. While this fucking excuse my language, while Dalcassians were coming up, they were like, they were starting to get freaked out, like.
mm,
So he's literally going, give me more hostages, but they didn't mean anything, because Mahon was going into Ossory and claiming hostages, and he was going into Oonach territory claiming hostages. So now we're moving past the whole cattle thing, even though that was a huge part of it still. We're
mm,
on about these hostages, right? And actually, this is not fantastical, and you probably attest to this, because it is written in a lot of sources that a lot of the time hostages were treated a lot
yeah.
better than even people of their own kin.
Mm,
Now, this all started changing in the 11th century. Now, things started getting a bit weird in the 11th century around hostages.
mm,
But up until this point, hostages were treated very well. It was like almost like an agreement, almost like a contract. And it was almost like, okay, you take them. I don't really know exactly. Maybe you might help me here, but I don't know exactly what did it mean that we're not going to kill you as king. We're taking your hostages. You can stay in
yeah.
place and submit to us, and then for a certain length of time, if you're good, we'll give you back your guys and gals and everything in between. Was that kind of the way
Well, it
it
depends
went?
on the agreements that they have in place, which they would have sorted out during the assemblies and stuff. So about four times, at least four times a year, they would have held assemblies, and they would have had the judges and
Hmm.
stuff come to this, where they would have done different agreements and stuff. Where is Fergus Kelly's Early Irish Law? Is the book that we need to read for this one. So yeah, I'll
It's kind of a minefield, though. Whenever I look
it
into it, it
is
does it, it's
highly.
it's a mixture of things.
It's 100% way easier to put in a hostages in there, but it really depends on the contracts and stuff that they do and they agree with later on with the judges and stuff, and this is why the judges is so important. And the contracts do change, and it depends which way they want to go with the assemblies and stuff. But you're right, like the hostages and also the children that are fostered in and stuff were treated far better, because they were nobles and guests, and you can't be just abusing, because it's such a low level. You're not really showing yourself as a great noble if you're not. So you have a guest that comes in, you kind of want to bring out the best of China. Do you know what I mean? The all the best stuff
Yeah,
that comes out for them and stuff, because you want them then to go back to it and think, oh, we better not mess with them. They're so fancy, they're so amazing and stuff. Just imagine what their military and stuff could do. And while I was there, I was treated absolutely amazing. Like, I was treated of my status, because I was a guest in their home. So you're completely right. They are treated even better than most. Like, they would be given gifts. They would be given stuff. Like they'll have, like, guaranteed. if Brian Brew was taking hostages, he was going into Cork because he had an amazing relationship with Cork. He would have gone into Cork and he would have bought the best of silk for them and stuff. And he wanted to dress them up. Like, so then when you have the assemblies and they're going into the assemblies, they're thinking to themselves, look at the hostages of Brian Brew. Look how well dressed they are. Do you know, geez, I wish
Like the
I was
neighbor, the
taken as a
neighbors
hostage.
coming, the neighbors looking over the fence
But
saying
that's
like,
exactly what
"Oh
they're
my God,
thinking.
look at this!"
That's exactly the same. They're having the assemblies. They're meeting up at these assemblies, having a few drinks and stuff,
Yeah.
and they're looking at Brian Brew's hostages, and they're thinking to themselves, "Jesus Christ, I wish I was taken as a bloody
A
hostage."
fella comes over with a glass of mead. He says,
Yeah,
"I'm not leaving here at all. This is fucking brilliant."
but that's it. That's exactly it. That's where we're. This is why I love medieval Ireland. You know, I this whole
Yeah,
idea
yeah,
of
yeah,
this submissive, like, and it's so crazy because for years, especially in the 1960s, we had this idea of these poor Irish people half naked wandering
yeah,
around the place, and
yeah,
yet in
yeah,
reality,
yeah.
they were having these big, massive assemblies
That's,
where you had
yeah,
Brian
yeah,
Brew's hostages all dressed up in the silk, just happy out, like, you know,
yeah,
completely
yeah.
different to the
And
fantasy of the
as well, like
1960s.
you're saying as well, though, once you defeated, like say for instance, let's just say in the Battle of Solcoit, right?
Mm,
It always kind of seems that they went on and then collected hostages
yeah,
from the areas around them. So it was like almost giving them permission
yeah,
to go on, and you were expected to kind of go and collect
mm,
hostages. So it was almost like the spoils of war,
oh
which
yeah.
is almost like the cattle raiding, as in a way, like,
Oh, big time. It was
um,
all about
yeah,
subjugation. Like they needed. So the
yeah,
thing is that if I'm and especially in Dublin, you were saying with your point of view and everything about the why is it that when they were taking these settlements? Okay, so Ivor of Waterford, sorry, the Ivor of Limerick, he had pushed the blood feud a bit too far with Brian Brew. So by the time Brian Brew breaches into the settlement, and then Ivor of Limerick then goes to one of the monastic settlements to look for protection, because technically speaking, you shouldn't be murdering people in monastic settlements, but Brian Brew pushes ahead anyway and chops
yeah,
them up,
yeah,
which is completely against the rules.
yeah.
But that's because the reason for that is because there was a blood feud going on, which is even more funny for Brian, because he's of the educated class. He's not a part of these Fenian war bands, so technically he shouldn't really have all these blood feuds on him. And yet, because Ivor of Limerick had been pushing and pushing and pushing these blood feuds for ages, it finally caught up with him. Where Brian
Well,
is
there's a
pushing into
reason for
Limerick.
that, though,
Yeah.
Phil. There's a very strong reason for
Mm.
that, though, as well. I must come in because, like,
Oh yeah.
what actually happened there is because we kind of skip ahead a bit
Mm.
because of time as well. Like,
Oh yeah.
just time is of the essence for
Mm.
people. Mahon does get the kingship of Munster, right? So
Mm.
he does essentially get it because there's nothing really left of the Oenochs, and the Viking power was finished as well. But what happens is Mahon probably dials it back a bit after
Mm.
all because there was many of these little skirmishes, battles, and things, and then he dials it back a bit, and he's probably right to start becoming more diplomatic because actually Brian did that himself. But the biggest issue was, and it was horrible and a tragedy, that Mahan, and it was a bit silly actually. It's kind of like something from Sopranos or The
Mm.
Godfather or something, or even the start of Braveheart. He goes to a peace treaty or a peace meeting with
Mm.
Donovan, and Donovan hands him over. Donovan is one of the other tribes that he defeated earlier on, and he hands him over to Malloy, which was the Oanachta, who was really pissed off with the fact that this Dalcassians, after usurping the crown, he's sitting on my throne. And Donovan hands him over to Maelmod Malloy. Ivar was involved. There was no doubt about it because I think he was involved. Because it's what Brian does after he actually Mahan gets killed. So it's a double cross. Mahan is, and this is written into the annals as well, treacherously slain at a peace thing, completely wrong,
Mm.
completely against all sorts of tradition and things like that. But then because Brian literally takes over from the mantle of kingship, but he doesn't actually take over the Munster kingship because he takes over the kings of the Dalcash for sure. But then that's the whole reason Maelmod actually killed Mahon, was to take the kingship back, the Munster kingship. But it was very empty. You know what I
Mm.
mean? It was like he literally just cursed himself almost.
Mm.
So then Brian kind of stood back for about 6 months or so, and literally went on a crusade.
Oh
Like
yeah.
he literally went down the Shannon, and he didn't stop at Limerick. He went straight to Scattery Island, where Ivar was hiding with his two
Mm.
sons, and he didn't stop at the monastery walls. He went straight in, and he slaughtered them.
Yeah.
He slaughtered them straight away. This was reactionary, but it was done with intent, because afterwards he went back to Limerick, literally burnt the place out of it,
Mm.
killed all the men of military age, right?
Mm.
And literally basically became the king of Limerick. He
Yeah.
kept all the wealthy traders and the merchants. There wasn't even a puppet king, as far as I know, of
Mm.
Limerick. Then he went on, and he actually the same year had his first battle, the Balaclacta, I think it was. Was
Yeah.
the Balaclacta or Caracun
Mm.
with Donovan? Walked through it,
Mm.
literally walked through that battle. Next up, Malloy. So this was, Brian didn't just say, I'm king of Munster. He literally went and killed every single one of the people that's slain or that were involved in the killing of Mahon.
Mm.
Right? So he didn't just claim kingship of Munster. He actually went and got kingship of Munster the correct way. Now, I disagree with what he did at the ecclesiastical monastery of Inishkag, but I say to myself, or sorry, Scattery Island, but I say to myself, I have a brother, and in those
Yeah.
times, I would have done it. I wouldn't care. I
Yeah.
would have done it. Of course, I would. I'd burst in the doors and I'd do it. I'd do
Yeah.
it, because you know what? At the end of the day, it is life. Like
Mm.
is it wrong? Yeah, of course it's wrong. But in the end, Brian gets slain while praying himself. The circle of life. That's this is the times we're living in.
Yeah.
Broder killed him in the end. But anyway, he became king of Munster
Mm.
after the Battle of Balaclacta with Malloy, which was the last of the Oanocks. And so we're going back to the question what Paddy asked earlier on. I think it was Paddy. Did the Oanoctas join Brian? There was no real
Oh yeah.
Oanoctas left, only Cian, which was son of Malloy.
Mm.
And Cian would submit to Brian, and Brian would actually marry his future daughter to Cian. So really, the Oanocta were gone. They did come back a little bit later on, well after Brian's death. A little bit, they had kingships, but they were literally annihilated. There was no more Oanoctas left. No, they became the McCarthys, like, you know
Yeah.
what I
I
mean?
was
They
just about
became
to say
essentially
that.
the
All right.
McCarthys.
And I'm sure Michael just
Yeah,
came
like I
pushing
don't.
back in.
Yeah,
You could sense that they
yeah, I
were
wasn't. I'm
starting to
not.
laugh.
Yeah. No, they were there, like, but in terms, I'm talking about in terms of status and kingship and things like
Mm.
that. Like they were essentially, you know, a part of Brian's domain. You
Mm.
know what I mean? They certainly did have some rebellions and things like that along the way, but nothing of great renown.
Mm.
So Brian Boru's on the throne of Munster now, like.
Yeah.
And it's something very interesting, and I can take a short break then. As you say, into things. He actually takes about 3 years.
Mm.
And actually, Sean Duffy notes this as well. It's like he gets kind of quiet after
Mm.
this. But imagine going on a crusade, something like a revenge film, like in the first 2 years of, and then you prove yourself, you get on that throne. Don't overreach, which he
Mm.
didn't do, because many,
Mm.
many a king done that throughout their reign. They overreached,
Yeah. Oh
and he
yeah.
didn't do that. He actually rebuilt. He
Mm.
obviously rebuilt. Now, I reckon at this point he was on his second marriage, because poor old Moore, another example of a woman that is lost in history, and she's just, I don't know. She kind of, when I'm writing my stuff, she always kind of sticks out for all
Mm.
the wives. I don't know why. Maybe because she brought Murrah into the world, his first son, who would become a major commander for him, and the one that was going to take over. So by this point, he would have a couple of children, probably another couple on the way. So you have to remember kingship. He has to solidify his, the kind of the judicial side of things, the kind of the legal side of things, the ecclesiastical side of things, rebuild, regain force, regain, kind of, power, like,
Mm.
because it's not that hard, or sorry, it's not that easy to go to war for 2 years on
Yeah.
the run, like, without a break.
Mm.
So that's what he did, and he started rebuilding his fortresses. But of course, what was coming was the rise to power of Brian Boru.
Yeah.
Um, they say, like, maybe every great success comes from one great crime. Maybe in the case of Brian, the great crime was bursting in the doors of the ecclesiastical monastery. But great success did come. And in the end, he did get slaughtered himself by a Viking. But
Mm.
my point is that he didn't rush in after that. He did actually settle into that provincial kingship
Mm.
and actually then started the rise of Brian Brew that we know today.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Very, very interesting stuff going on there, and it's kind of interesting here. We have multiple different interpretations as well with the standard of the Owen Octa, how we have a level of slaying going on between the Owen Octa, and then we have Owen Octa, which ones were sticking around, which ones were knocked off the mantle and stuff, especially when we're going into the period as well with Mael Shocknall II, who at the same time as we see the rise of Brian Brew happening in the south of the island of Ireland, we also see Mael Shocknall II, who's suddenly taken the over kingship of Ireland up in Tara. He's declared king of Tara, and then from there he has the glorious Battle of Tara against Amleth Cuaran, who we mentioned way early on in the presentation. Amleth Cuaran, who was married into the kingship of Leinster, which definitely put what's it called, relationship between Dublin and Munster on each other's radar. The fact that Brian Brew is moving into Leinster, taking up that territory, but at the same time you have the kings of Dublin that want to defend their allies and stuff as well, but they're also being subjugated and attacked by what was it, Mael Shocknall II, who eventually beats the men of Dublin at the big, massive battle, the Battle of Tara, where the men of Dublin are defeated, and then Mael Shocknall is able to break into Dublin and occupies and takes over Dublin, and then he puts in his puppet government, which is led by Sitric Silkenbeard, which, funny enough, you've pointed out that there is a lot of relationships there between Sitric Silkenbeard, and not just Leinster, but also with the Enail, and then later on as well, as you'll highlight, his relationship with Brian Brew, and his marriages and stuff that will kick
Yeah,
off
I
there
just
as
want to
well.
just very quickly jump in as well, and I like look, maybe my Munster kind of Tralee kind of way of talking can kind of be very like
Mm,
but I will say this: I'm not downplaying Oanoctas, and what I was really, I just have to make sure people understand this.
mm,
What I meant was like in terms of their claim, or they always had a claim because they were the Oanoctas, but in terms of their trying to get themselves back on the throne of Munster,
mm,
it was over. That's
yeah,
kind of what I meant. Like the Oanocta tribe, of course, they were still there. Like
yeah,
there's no doubt about that. Like he didn't like kill about 1,000 people. Like you know what I mean?
mm,
I mean they were still there. Like they were fighting at Clontarf.
yeah.
But that's what I meant, just to be absolutely clear.
Ah, yeah, 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 yeah. That's much more clear. The fact he didn't just go off and what was it called? Cleanse all of them.
Yeah,
He wasn't popping up
definitely not.
at he wasn't
No.
popping up on Sunday church like the what was it, the bloody hell, the Douglases, who were popping up on church on a Sunday to chop people up. He wasn't doing that kind of
Definitely
stuff.
not. No,
Yeah.
I think my point was that he actually he kind of set a stall out in terms of getting the kingship of Munster, and I think it was quite clear throughout the province
Mm,
because of the hostages, because of what he achieved and the battles he fought and won. I think it was quite clear there was no real kind of taking him on at that point, like you
mm.
know. But there wasn't any sort of Vlad the Impaler type of thing going on where he was going
Yeah.
around to the Onactas and you know,
Yeah, and because
that
you
type of
highlighted
thing.
that as well,
You know?
where Vlad does go into settlements during his period, and that I think that's a very good thing to highlight, the fact that Vlad went into settlements and he was killing merchants, like he was putting merchants over a spit and burning them and stuff, which is a huge, massive no, especially financially, because that's financial suicide.
Yeah.
Brian Brew never does this. He does. Don't get me wrong. He does replace Ivor of
No.
Limerick, but Ivor of Limerick had pushed the blood feud way past what it should have been.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to
Yeah.
Dublin and Waterford, Brian never undermines the financial economics of
Yes.
those areas. He
No.
leaves the nobility alone inside there, and as you highlighted there, that's why you had fosterage. That's why we had hostages being taken, and that's why Brian straight away was trying to build up those marriage alliances and
Yeah.
trying to bring these
And
people in.
Keane,
You know.
Cian was son. The guy that he defeated in that major battle, which basically won him the kingship. Cian was son of Malloy.
Mm,
Cian submitted to Brian afterwards, and then Brian married his daughter to him. This was like the beginning of that kind of stage of Brian's career,
mm.
marrying his daughters to these people that were his enemies, essentially,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
But so like after the Ivar thing, that was the only time is that he went in and tried to wipe out a dynasty.
Mm,
You know what I mean? He never did that afterwards, even though I said as you before the stream, and maybe it's a little bit controversial. I think he should have wiped out Citric. Like that's just my opinion,
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
But he never did that. And flat, there's one person to get into
Oh shit.
probably my flat up or Flaherty of the North, who was a disaster. He
Mm,
was a complete disaster. Like he went up 3 times. Imagine having to go all the way up to Munster, up to the north. Now we'll get into this in my stream. 3 times and submit him every time. And in the end, he married a daughter. Brian was never. So that's when people say, "Oh, he was a dictator and he was going around and he was." And I just can't. I don't buy that at all. Like it's just
mm.
absolutely not true. Like if you're going to say that he's a dictator, then every single king of that time was a mini dictator. That
Yeah,
you have to literally brand them all that, because what he was doing was essentially what every king was doing, except he did it in a kind of enhanced way, in my opinion. He did it in a way where it just stands out from the rest because of, as we were mentioning, his tactics and acting on, the weaknesses of others, and just the timing of things. He just stands out, but he's not different. Like
mm, mm, mm.
he's doing what a king should be doing, So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to say about that part. Where are we now? So we're on consolidating of
We're
power. So
just at the point where Mael Shocknell the second and Brian Brew are starting to
yeah,
clash. So we have Mael Shocknell the second that's kind of subjugated Dublin, and he's recognised as the Over King, as the annals would recognise him as King of Tara. So anytime you see King of Tara, he's basically the main for everyone listening to this. He's basically become the main representative of King of Ireland, which is recognised by the likes of the papacy and the Anglo-Saxon kings and stuff. So at this point, Mael Shocknell is recognised internationally as kind of like the main representative of the kingship of Ireland, which is the over kingship. And Brian Brew now he's, as we said, consolidating power in the south of Ireland, and eventually the two of them are going to be challenging each other's rule, especially since Brian Brew wants to push
yeah,
up and capture that over kingship of Ireland. So
yeah.
it's kind of where
So
we are
yeah,
now.
definitely. And this and yeah, yeah. So let me just have a look here now. So by this point, Brian Boru was king of Munster, undisputed, unopposed, 100%. He started getting into the territories of Ossory. He started doing things after a couple of years around 983, and this is where Malik he actually starts to notice him. And I think he made a big mistake. I'm going to be honest with you. Although I really respect him, and I respect what he did after Clontarf, because he came in and settled things down a little bit. But I think he made a big mistake because I thought it was very reactionary.
Mm,
So he wanted to make a statement to Brian Boru, and I went to the my hour. I think it's my hour, but I was
mm,
calling it Mag Adar at the time. It was awful Gaelga. It's my hour, so it's the inauguration point for the Dalcassians.
mm,
Beautiful place, powerful place in the Tulla region, Quinn region of County Clare,
mm.
about 10 to 20 kilometres away from the Dalcash from Killaloe, sorry.
Yeah.
So anyway, Malachy Moore came down and he basically went onto their land. And the way they used to actually inaugurate a king at that time was they used to have a thing called a billay, or a kind of sacred tree, and
Mm,
they would take off a branch, and then he would hold the branch to king, and they would inaugurate the king as king of the clan, or as a provincial king, high king, whatever. I don't know exactly. Was it exactly the same way in every place? It seems to be. I know definitely about this place it was. I'm pretty sure it was the same everywhere. Um, but Maliki came down, and Mail Shacknail came down, and he basically cut down the tree,
oh yeah.
And I just think it was a very petty. Um, but Sean Duffy does actually talk about it in a good way, which kind of calms me down a little bit because I think it's very petty. But he says that it's funny how we look at these kings, right, from a modern perspective as all barbaric and running around naked with their axes and things. But what we see there was a guy saying, "Listen now, buddy. There's your inauguration tree. You might have announced yourself as king, but I am the fucking king here.
Yeah.
This doesn't mean nothing to me. You know what I mean? It's like sending a nasty text to someone or something like that,
Yeah, yeah,
saying, "Listen, now, buddy, you better watch yourself."
mm,
Um, but this literally did absolutely nothing
mm,
because Brian literally started reacting, not reacting. He just continued on with his plans because
mm,
I say not reacting because I'm not trying to say, oh, he didn't react. I think there was a plan underway. I think he literally just continued campaigning.
mm,
So let me just see here. Let's see, like even let's just say it right. 982, he went into Ossory. It was a failed campaign. Then he went down into Waterford, into the Deshi lands. 983, 984, 985. He started, and then 988. He started going literally in all directions, literally
mm,
in all directions. And what this was all about going up into these places, making message or giving the messages. This is who I am. This is what's happening. I'm coming onto your land. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. I'm doing this. And that's why I think Mail Shacknail made a big mistake. He came down and knocked down the tree, and that was it. He didn't actually come down and actually plunder, and he didn't act, or maybe he did plunder, but he didn't come down and do much else.
mm.
That was kind of it. But then Brian is actually campaigning all over the place. Like he's like literally just going all over the place every year, pretty much, or every other year. And you can kind of see that Malachi's kind of like probably thinking to himself, what the hell is going on here? Like,
Mm.
do you know, this fucking guy, like, and I have a map right in front of me, and it shows literally all the campaigns he was doing, including naval campaigns, including right up the River Shannon, right up to the locks up there, Loch and Loch, and he's coming up and he's saying to Malachy, he's saying, "Listen, I'm
Mm.
here, and I'm knocking on your doorstep." You know, and I think it's fascinating, and that's why I'm attracted to the stories because of the audacity of it, but the arrogance of it, and the kind of like the confidence of it. You know?
It is definitely very, very fascinating that he, like, for somebody who didn't join a warband in his youth, he spent most of it inside of the Ross area getting his education and stuff. That he's somebody that picks up skirmish warfare, all those little battles and stuff, constantly harassing, constantly doing the hit and run tactics and stuff. That Brian Bruce so good at it. For somebody who was never a part of the
Unbelievable.
war bands and stuff, he would have got the education of battles and stuff. But God, like he seems to be, he picks up military history so well, not military history, military tactics so easily. It really does highlight
Yeah.
the fact that he was an absolute genius. So
And
he was
and there was
exceptionally
one thing
gifted.
that there's one thing that we should mention as well because we could easily skip this, and we would definitely be kind of backtracking. By this point, obviously he had Limerick, right?
Mm,
But by this point, around 984, he started getting involved with the Vikings of Waterford, another Ivar.
mm,
And this was the way things started turning in a big way. I think there was this guy. I think he was one of the Haraldsons
mm,
that actually had taken Ivar of Limerick hostage at one point. And you
mm.
could imagine Brian's down. See, it seemed like Brian and Ivar of Waterford literally were buddies from the get go,
Yeah.
for whatever reason. And it seems like, from what I researched, that there was a meeting between Haraldson's Ivar and Brian around 984. They had this common enemy, and obviously Haraldson's probably digged Brian because he's like, I had him hostage at one point. What an arsehole he was.
Mm,
Brian probably said, well, he's gone now, you know what I mean? And they laughed about it. So this was the point when Brian is making deals with Ivar of Waterford, like, and
mm,
literally incorporating them into the fleet.
mm.
So not only is Brian coming up with these campaigns on foot and on this by the Shannon, but now he's coming up with massive amounts of Viking boats
Oh yeah.
coming up the Shannon,
Well, you see, this
and it's
this is
just like,
yeah. What you're pointing out is a very, very good important point. The Vikings of Cork and the Vikings of Waterford do not agree with the Vikings of Dublin or the Vikings of Limerick. In fact, they're
yeah,
having the same feuds. when at the very start of the Viking Age, when the Vikings are starting to settle down, the Vikings of Cork are taken in as mercenaries for St. Finbarr's Church to protect St. Finbarr's monastic church against the Oenachta, against Cashel. Cashel coming down under Philmid, King of Ireland, and attacking Cork. In fact, the Bishop of Cork is taken, and he's brought to Cashel and he's starved to death, you know. And the reason why I highlight this is the fact that politics in Ireland is far more complicated than the Vikings versus the Irish. That in fact St. Finbarr's Church in Cork, which is there today, if you actually look at it, St. Finbarr's Church is about here, and right next to it is South Main Street, where the Vikings were living.
Yeah.
The Vikings had built a fortification right next to the monastic settlement to protect it against the Oenachta, who were coming down and sacking and wrecking the place up and kidnapping the Bishop of Cork and starving him to death in Cashel. And it's the same thing with the men of Waterford. The men of Waterford come in there and they have a completely different relationship with the locals. Once again, when the men of Waterford rock up, they allied themselves with the local Daisha, the two of the Daisha, and then they go against the Ushraga. So they have a constant every single season, where at the start of the season we have the men of Cork fighting the Oenachta and Cashel, and obviously having that positive relationship with Brian Broods to it, which has been happening for 200 years now, on and off seasonally. And then they have that rivalship against Limerick, because Limerick is allied with the Oenachta and Cashel, so they automatically, the Cork Vikings hate the Vikings in Limerick, and vice versa for the Vikings of Waterford. They're allied with the men of Daisha, but they're fighting the men of Ushraga. Every season they would meet up and skirmish and rob each other's cattle, burn each other's lands, so on and so forth. So yeah, 100%, when Brian Boru came into those areas and he's trying to subjugate the men of Leinster, of course he's going to ally himself with the likes of the Daisha and the men of Waterford. So
Yeah, and it's kind of likely as well at this point that there was one or two smaller kings of Leinster that were having their kind of grievances as well with Dublin. There's one I can't remember his name, or did he? No, sorry, maybe I take that back. I think he took captive of a major king. I think it was Gilpatrick or something around the 980s. Is it? Do you know that? Like he took captive of that king, and he didn't kill him, right? First of all, he didn't kill him. He took him captive, and eventually he submitted. I think this was a big inroad into Leinster, because remember what's actually happening here is that he's actually gaining power bit by bit around the whole of Southern Ireland. So in this case, we often, because we get mixed up modern day, we think Southern Ireland is like just a republic, but it's obviously not. Southern Ireland is a line going across, and it's like it's Munster, it's Ossory and Leinster and Dublin. That's part of Southern Ireland, and then that's called Le Maga. But of course, Dublin is right on the edge as well, and that's always the contested part. Le Cuin as well, and Le Cuin then is the northern part. But there was one particular episode with a king of Leinster, and not the king of Leinster, but I think a minor king, or maybe it was the king of Leinster. But anyway, the point is that he's starting to make these inroads, and of course, this is freaking male shack nail out. Like it's like he can't understand it. But I made an earlier video, and it's probably a little bit amateur and a little bit, an early kind of, interpretation of what I perceived as his life and career. But I still will remain true to my points in that video, that I feel that Brian Boru was capitalizing on something that other people didn't capitalize on, and because it was kind of neglected by the High Kings of the North, because it was always the High Kings of the North, they were more interested in what was going on in the North. Of course they were. So that there was all these power bases in the South, the Viking power bases, and there was all this stuff going on, this major stuff going on in the South. And because the Overking didn't really get involved with what was going on, except just exert power and stuff over them, then I feel it was just a matter of time before someone came in and consolidated all of that and literally moved up to the North. And that's why I think Brian was like a kind of a product of his whole environment, not just the province of, or sorry, not just the Dalcassian kingdom, but the whole entire Southern Ireland. He's like a product of this place.
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
I hundred
I don't know.
percent
I don't know if you
supporting that
agree with that.
because you can see that straight away at the very start of the Viking Age with the rise of Philmed, King of Ireland. Philmed, King of Ireland, was a Munster king, and because the the Enel were so pinned down with their own politics up in the north,
Yeah,
when Philmed is on the rise, he just flies through the Enel because the Enel are burned out from fighting each other. So when Philmed rocks in, he just quickly snaps it up. Now, don't get me wrong. Once the the Enel, click on to exactly what the Onacta are capable of doing, they get on them so fast, and that's why you have Mael Shocknod the first, King of Ireland. That's why you then have Flan Shinna, Flan over Ireland, King of Ireland as well. That once the Over Kings switch on to, oh Jesus Christ, we better resubjugate all these Munster kings and pin them back into place again. But this is 100 years later. This is, sorry, not even
yeah,
100. This is two
yeah,
hundred years later.
yeah.
The
The
was it the
Viking power
Enel.
bases didn't exist.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the ENL are back to making the same mistakes again, where they're very much involved with their own internal fighting that's going in, perhaps not paying attention to what's happening in the south, and you basically have
They
a
weren't
landslide that's
supportive
happening.
to. Yeah, and they weren't supportive, which is probably a bit of a later. They weren't supportive to Mail Shacknell. Like when he
Mm,
needed them, they just deserted him.
yeah,
Like so, and I think that's the difference between say him at that time and say Brian.
yeah,
And obviously we're skipping ahead slightly, but that's the difference is that Brian had the support
mm,
of the South.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Obviously you had fellas rebelling against him, you had stuff going on, but essentially he kind of had the consolidated support
mm.
like, and he was literally, it was only a matter of time,
Oh yeah,
before he went up there and took it. But what I like about the story as well is like he didn't, maybe he could have went a bit earlier.
mm,
Maybe he could have went up in the mid 980s or the mid, he could have went up maybe 990, but he
mm,
didn't. He waited a while. He waited a while, like, and maybe we can kind of get into like obviously there's that stuff about the campaigns into Leinster supports religious reform. Yeah, there's something very quickly I will say, but before the treaty, one huge thing that he did do in this time of consolidating in the south was rebuilding the churches. There's one actually thing that I found out as well, which was actually quite interesting. The churches, of course, they were Oanuk the churches in
mm,
of that time, So like they were like looking at this guy as well. Like say the ones that are based in the kind of Oanuk, traditionally the Oanuk regions, and they're kind of looking at this guy and they're like, not too sure about this guy, like,
mm,
and so Brian kind of had to sort that stuff out, and he kind of had to do this political stuff where he kind of had to make announcements. There's no more robbers of the churches. He had to kind of offer them protection. He kind of had to go in and kind of show them who's boss as well, like, and
mm,
say, look. And then that's kind of when Markin starts to rise, his own brother, where he becomes abbot of Emly, even though Emly wasn't a huge stature of a church, but it just shows that he's moving out of his own part of his kingdom and into the kind of more, lands of Tipperary, I believe it is.
mm.
So there's this kind of thing about the church as well, which kind of leads towards this kind of Charlemagne of Ireland kind of idea,
Yeah,
like um, really kind of incorporating. He understood that, and I actually think, man, I think as well, it's a theory of mine, is that Markin was a huge influence. You see, I don't think it's just Brian. Every great leader has great people around them, great
mm.
women around them, great men around them,
Oh yeah,
and he probably was listening to his older brother Markin saying, "Listen, get me into that church there. You need to sort them out. You need to do this. You need to do
mm,
that. Eventually, I can become bishop of this whole area." And Brian is like, "That's probably a good idea." Like he was
yeah.
10 years younger, So it's like is that type of thing is going on
Oh,
because we get
totally.
lost in the battles, you
Yeah.
know.
Oh, we do. Because even Claire Downham's work recently, she's done a lot of work with the ENL and stuff. Sorry, not the ENL, the what's it called, the Irish Vikings, the Emer
Yeah,
in Dublin and stuff. And it suddenly dawned on her, like, Jesus Christ, this is not a dark. Because for a very very long time we had this interpretation that we have a golden age of Ireland, Then we have the Viking Age, and that's sort of a dip down into a dark age of some sort. No, 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 no. Once Claire Downham had done her research into Dublin, and a lot of other academics have done a lot of recent research into all of this. No way, this is an economic golden age we're actually looking at here.
Yeah,
As we were saying before, even this whole idea of a naked Irishman running around the place, you need to quickly put that into bed. Especially with the work
ridiculous.
of Claire Downham now, we're looking at. Look at the Battle of Tara. It says it bloody in the annals. We have men rocking up to battle dressed in silk and riveted mail. Like these guys are just
Yeah,
fully kitted out. You over and over again, we're seeing an economic golden age. Ireland now is connected into, from the Dublin ports, are connected into the wider Viking trade route that goes all the way to the Byzantine Empire, modern day Istanbul, and then connected all the way over to Baghdad. It's connected into the heart of the Silk Road, and then from there it goes all the way over to China. And we have proof of that. We found in the archaeology evidence that we have found in Dublin, we actually have women have silk caps, women have silk and dresses and everything all the way as far as China. Now we haven't proven obviously the Chinese dress, but it's in the realm of possibility because we found the
of
silk
course,
cap. So we're
of course.
looking at an economic golden age. As we were saying
Absolutely.
there,
That's been proven by Thomas Cahill as
oh,
well. That book, that great book. You know the book I'm on about, the Irish Saved Western
oh
Civilization.
yes, yeah, 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 yeah. I know that one. All right, yeah.
I know it's a little bit of a different kind
Mm,
of about more about the monks and stuff like that, but we were like literally a shining light
yeah.
during through the Dark Ages.
Oh
I mean,
yeah,
that's like
100%.
I totally agree with you. Totally agree.
Mm. And that this whole idea of us running around half naked. No, there's plenty. Not only were people dressed fine, but as we were saying there, Brian Boru would have brought his hostages about. His hostages must have been
Yeah,
dressed in the finest silk just for
yeah,
him to show off. Hey, look, I'm. And
yeah,
this is the part where we're moving up to next, where he's pushing up now to take even more power,
yeah,
because he
yeah,
wants to show that
definitely.
rise.
Yeah, so definitely going to move on. I have a little kind of sentence here written before the Treaty of Mael Shacknell, which
Mm,
leads into it. Brian was indeed the overlord of South Ireland, maybe not in stat and maybe not in name yet, but there was no denying it now. Politically, military, status, alliances, technology, hostages, submissions, fortresses, churches, and symbolically, Brian had the advantage, or at least half the power of Ireland. It was time to meet this fella Malachy. They must have been thinking. So the messengers were sent. A huge formal engagement would take place. Now, this is contested where it was. Could have been Clontarf, Port, the Connacht, and the Lochry. No matter what, it was definitely more so in the Kingdom of Mead territory. So
mm,
up in Malachy's territory, essentially. So the treaty with Mael Shacknell in 997 AD,
mm,
this was the big moment, the big turning point. Some place the meeting closer to Clonfert, as I said, the Offaly tip border. But wherever it took place, it was a royal meeting assembly. Imagine the huge affair of this. Of course, Mael
mm,
Shacknell was probably going to put on a massive show as well. And one thing I will say about this before Brian Boru did actually go up to Ishnach,
mm,
and he had campaigns going up to Ishnach and Tara before the treaty. So he was all about the symbolic nature of what he was trying to do. These were facts. Sean Duffy talks about that in his
mm,
book as well. Camp, literally just going up to these places, not to take on anyone, but just to say, I'm here. So, of course, Mael Shacknell would have turned around and said, okay, you're in my land now. Let's put on a big show. And it's probably be a massive, massive, massive engagement, probably maybe a few days, maybe a week of games and fun fairs and entertainment and whatever they did in medieval times. And they have, of course, probably had their discussions, had their long, long discussions. I would imagine so anyway. And because in the end, it was a huge moment. It was a huge thing to decide for
mm.
Mael Shacknell's pride. And also, I do believe as well, it shows a bit of decorum from Brian as well, because he could have, a rasher king could have taken him on there and then, like, you know what I mean? But he
Oh yeah.
didn't. I definitely think there was a decorum and definitely a civility and almost like a no. He did kind of go on afterwards and take over, but at this point there was a certain amount of respect and you know probably was a good guest. I would imagine. I would imagine so, and I would imagine that there was long discussions, and in the end, it was 20 years after his brother's murder,
Mm.
and Brian, had now become the official lord of the southern half of Ireland. This was the first time it happened in a long time.
Mm.
This did happen, especially in mythological mythological stories,
Yeah.
up until the semi-historical stories. I believe there was
Mm-hmm.
probably halves
Yeah,
of Ireland. Yeah,
yeah, it happens a few times. All right, where they split the island
yeah.
between the two sides. The mythology side of it now, just it's slightly old in my mind to be honest with you. But yeah,
Yeah,
I
no, that's
remember what
fine.
you're
That's
talking about.
fine.
All
That's
right.
fine. That's fine.
Mm.
But anyway, just to finish this part, because we're pushing on for the next year or so. So basically, by the end of this, Lechuan, I think that's how you pronounce it. That's what Mael Shacknail was in charge of. That's the
Mm.
northern half of Ireland, right? Split right in the middle. Brian Boru was the king of the south. So basically, essentially, two over kings
Mm.
ruling the island.
Mm.
So for the next year or so, they'd work in tandem with one another. It wasn't some sort of thing that Brian went against immediately. It took a while
Mm.
because they worked in tandem. They had raids into Leinster, Connachts in conjunction with other handing over. I think what they actually had going on there with the hostages was to balance the power. This shows like the level of intelligence as well, because I didn't even think of this.
Mm.
Let's just say Mael Shacknail went into the Connacht, right? If he attained hostages, he'd hand them over to Brian, and Brian would hand over his Leinster hostages to Mael Shacknail, which I think, if that's true,
Yeah.
that's unbelievable.
Yes.
Balancing power, right? It's unreal. So these guys weren't stupid running around. To mention running around, we're mentioning running around naked a lot because I think we both seen the same movies recently
Yeah.
where the Gael are just fucking, you know. But the one problem with all of this was the city of Dublin.
Mm.
So it was subject to both of them essentially. So as a team, they would take hostages and spoil the Dublin, and this would lead us on, of course, to the first major battle of the two over kings,
Mm.
the Battle of Glanmama in 999. Um, if you want me to just power ahead, I can,
Oh
or
yeah,
if you
yeah,
do
yeah.
you want to
Keep
come
going,
in
keep
here,
going, go on. No, no, keep going,
keep
keep
going.
going. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So the Battle of Glanmama, this is actually a very, again, when people talk about the Battle of Tara, I would say, but what about the Battle of Glanmama? Like, I
Mm.
mean, this is essentially a small little version of the Battle of Clontarf. Here's where we get the first mention of Citric Silkenbeard, because up to this point, around 2 years before, Mael Shacknail actually had a half Norse Gael brother that it was a puppet king of Dublin, Glunrin, I think his name was, Irony, son of Olaf Curran. So
Mm.
anyway, they went to war with Citric Silkenbeard, who was ruling Dublin, plus his uncle Maelmorda, who wasn't actually King of Leinster at the time, but he was attempting to gain kingship of Leinster. They became a huge problem for Boru because he wanted submission from Leinster,
Mm.
from King Donogh MacDonald Clane, and I think he was actually taken hostage by Dublin. So this essentially led, so Maelmorda's attempt to take kingship of Leinster was to take Donogh MacDonald Clane, I think is how you pronounce it, took hostage. And then this was a really weird one, by the way,
Mhm.
because they went to war, or went to the battle at December 30th of 999.
Mm.
Like, that's crazy. To go to a battle during winter, like, it's very, very
It
peculiar.
is. It
So this
is. It's
was,
very difficult, trying to move that much force up when people are supposed to, especially when there's a lack of food and everything, and even the equipment.
yeah,
Trying to stay out there, yeah, it's a I can't remember the specific word I'm looking for, but it is a nightmare. Trying to organize
it
everything and
is.
everything. Oh, absolutely. That's
It's
why
just the
yeah.
weather
But
alone, and the
even
soil and everything, it would
mm,
just be a disaster.
but even the Battle
But
of
it just
Clontarf
shows,
itself, yeah,
it shows how important that he wanted. It's almost like there was a huge urgency
yeah,
because he must have anticipated something.
mm,
And this is where I kind of jump in with my theories. Like, I just wish he annihilated the two of them during that, because I think he would have taken away a lot of
mm,
his thorns in his sides. Like, you
yeah.
know. But that's just my theory. I don't know how you feel about that.
Oh, from my interpretation, it's far more complicated. Because I was saying
Yeah,
before, if you remove somebody who's very much connected with this massive, especially Citric, Citric,
Mm.
straight away when he's put into the kingship, is really, really gifted internationally. Just like Brian Boru, like don't get me wrong, Brian Boru internationally is very respected as well, and we could see that in the both the Frankish literature, the Icelandic literature, and the Norwegian literature, that there's so much respect given to Brian Boru. That's why we know the Brian Boru saga is missing, because the Scandinavians do hold Brian Boru at high respect. But that's the same thing with
Yeah.
Citric. Because the thing is that when you rocked up, if you were a noble and you rocked up in Citric's court, he gave you, not only did he give you the best of stuff, but we can see in the Icelandic saga that he was gifting people with beautiful weapons, with silk clothing. The gifts were going out like there was no tomorrow. So the likes of Citric Silkenbeard and Brian Boru were held at high esteem. So from my interpretation, not only would have it crippled Brian Boru financially to remove somebody who's very switched on with the economic and finance and trade that was going on in Dublin and the larger trade routes, but it also would have hurt him politically because of the
Yeah.
respect that
You're
Citric
right.
had
You're
overseas.
right.
It would be like
No.
Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil removing the boys over in Kerry, the lads who have that high connection with the Irish Americans today. Bloody hell,
At
good.
least Mail Morda. Give me that much. Give me Mail Morda. If he was killed, give me that fella, and I'd be grand because he wasn't king of Leinster yet. So
Yeah, yeah, it's
if he
true.
was chopped, if he was, give me that, and I'll be happy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very, very true.
Yeah.
So yeah, we just finished
Yeah.
up with that battle, and now we have Brian
Yeah.
Brew who's
So
pushing for the kingship.
yeah, so like we kind of mentioned this before as well that this was a huge success,
Mm,
and this was a time when actually the two over kings came together and actually did work together and they defeated Citric, and actually they did actually have some like proper Vikings coming in. I think there was a small bastion of Vikings that Citric brought in. I'm not
mm.
100% sure, maybe a few from Man,
Yeah.
that came in and fought at Battle of Glaumama. Anyway, after this, Mail Murder wasn't decapitated, so or the dispatch. So I shouldn't say that on the YouTube live. Sorry.
It would be
Uh,
grand. I've
um.
been getting away with a lot lately with monetization. I think it's just when
Okay.
lads
Okay.
start talking about certain subjects, that's when YouTube gets
Ah.
a
Yeah.
bit annoyed. But no, we're not talking about that today, and we don't have any plans to talk about that. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Exactly.
decapitation
Exactly.
of male marauders is okay, I think. Anyway, I think.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, I wish it happened. It's a thing of mine. But anyway, Citric did actually go off. He actually went off and he ran off like the great survivor. He really sticks to that label. Like he went off to the Isles. And I do think that there was a lot of negotiations happening with him and certain individuals outside of there. Now, that's just a theory. He definitely negotiated his way back. And you're right, because there must have been a reason why they wanted him back, because
Mm,
he negotiated a return and he submitted to Brian and handed over hostages. And then Brian
really?
married his daughter's, yeah, sausages as well as hostages.
Oh.
Brian married his daughter Slana to him, and this is another part of the diplomatic kind of bringing the marriage alliances in.
Mm,
He married his daughter. Imagine that in Dublin. There was a big ceremony. Brian Boru, he submitted to Brian. Brian's family now is intertwined with him. So now this was a big problem for Mail Shacknail,
mm.
because Brian now had control of the three ports,
Yeah,
essentially, right?
big time.
So this was going to be a massive issue, and it was only a matter of time before Brian actually said to himself, "You know what? I'm actually really the Ardry of Heron. Like,
Oh yeah.
I'm actually the boss here, because not only do I have southern half of Ireland, I've got the three ports.
Mm,
They've all submitted to me, and so this kind of was starting to come on into the radar around 1000 AD.
mm.
There started to be kind of a little bit of a shaky ground between Mail Shacknail and Brian Boru. There started to be a little bit of talks, a little bit of kind of Brian moving into places he shouldn't have been. He didn't agree to, and things like that. And this is where I think Maliki probably knew that the game was up,
Yeah.
because I think there was a couple of raids. Oh, this is sorry. Yeah, sorry. I skipped ahead. He definitely marched on Ishnok before the treaty with Mail Shacknail.
Mm,
But when Brian finally made up his mind, he did something which I think is unbelievable. And imagine this in a cinematic movie, in a TV show, whatever. But obviously, in the big screen would be better. He decided, I'm going marching on Tara.
Mm.
So he just marched on Tara, broke the agreement with Mail Shacknail. He did. He broke the agreement. It wasn't. I don't think it was a formal agreement. I think it was merely a handshake. Who knows? Maybe there was a document. Anyway, he broke it. Marched on Tara. Tara at this point, we all know that Tara was the formal inauguration point for the High Kings of Ireland. By this point, it was more of a kind of, kind of what we see today, kind of a place of yesteryear, but very much held symbolically in high regard. There may have been a type of Dune there or whatever. There may have been some presence there. Brian rocked up with the whole of Southern Ireland, and he said, listen, it's time to kind of say the inevitable. And apparently there is some sort of agreement between Mail Shackney and Malachi Moore and Brian to say, look, he tried to get Malachi tried to get the support of the Northern Eneals, and he'd never got anything. He never got any support at this point. So then he did apparently go to Brian and say, listen, I have no support at the moment. Can you give me a year? Now, is this true? I have no idea. Maybe it is, because apparently he did go to Connacht and was really scrambling, because there is a kind of a record of him building some sort of ford across the River Shannon with the Connacht men, because they were sick of Brian going up the Shannon. None of it worked because in the end it was just not happening. So really there was no battle, there was no man lost their life, there was no real plundering. Mail Shacknail just yields in the end at 10:02, and he formally gives up.
Yeah, I think Mail Shacknail II wasn't stupid. He was not only was he, in my opinion, I think he was a pretty nice guy, to be honest with you, and you can see that by the way he speaks after the Battle of Tara, and when he goes into Dublin and he's shocked and horrified at the way the slaves are treated. You kind of get this image of a pretty switched on, nice guy. And when he knew he was choked financially, as you pointed out there, that those ports were captured, that was pretty much Mail Shacknail on the ropes. And I think, as you said there, he frustratedly runs around Ireland trying to see what he can do. But once he's choked financially, the game is up. And he's such a good little chess player. He's the type of chess player.
Sorry, sorry, not to interrupt. I was seeing Clans and Dynasties. He said 100% you can have Mail Morda. Yes. That's definitely getting into the movie when it made, with my reinterpretation of it. It's going to be like one of those Quentin Tarantino movies when he rewrites the end of the story.
So that's pretty much us finished there. I seen the sausages in, and I was thinking about, I don't know if you've played it as well, the Kingdom Come Deliverance. On my channel we had sausages because Henry was always hungry for sausages on my channel. So we had that going for a while. Myself and Michael might make a t-shirt, or maybe Bertie, you'll make a t-shirt as well on sausages.
I think this is the thing. This is actually, I need to get trademarking this, because this is kind of cool, to be honest. Sausages for hostages. Someone's saying hostages for sausages. I don't know. It depends on how many sausages. You have a big army to feed, you know what I mean?
Especially since lads are cutting off sausages later on. As you said there, they were all nicey in this period. And a whole load of chivalry happening in the 11th century. But then when we go into the 12th century, then they're cutting off penises and eyeballs, to stop them taking the kingship and stuff.
Still happening today.
Just to quickly go through the questions. I don't know if there's any questions you want to, because we're finished now. That's the last of the slides. Yeah. And next week, just to highlight, guys, if you want to see the continuation of this, we're jumping over to Bertie's channel on the 23rd, about this time again, 11 o'clock, to do the anniversary of the Battle of Clontarf. So this is only a build-up, lads, to the Battle of Clontarf. Yeah. And I hope you really, really enjoyed that. And on saying that as well, guys, if you really enjoy Bertie's work, because as you know yourself, God, Bertie, you're really, really switched on. You've really done all of the
thanks, buddy.
Work for this. Oh, you're more than welcome. Make sure you grab Bertie's first. This is definitely the first book, isn't it? You haven't done anything else before this.
This is the first one.
This is the very first one. There's no...
Yeah, and just to give people an idea what it is, it's a premium color print, so it's a novella. It was born out of the movie. Timothy V. Murphy was lined up. I had a whole crew and everything. We had money in place. It just kind of fell apart in the end. The script is actually at the back of the book. So the story is born out of the script. It's a bigger version of the script because it was meant to be a short film. So you got some artwork, specially commissioned map in there. If people are very serious as well, I'm putting together a list for signed copies. I've already sold about 40 signed copies. If people want a signed copy, they're more expensive. Get in touch with me and I can get you on a list. But if not, get onto Amazon. It's available in all sorts of places. Very proud of it. It's obviously the first of a sequel or first of a trilogy. I'm writing the sequel at the moment. And actually, I want to thank Philip Goramila Malgut
Oh, you're more than welcome.
Makara for really kind of getting me back into this. He didn't do it, he didn't know this, but he's actually after switching me back into my research because I had fallen off. Now I'm back into my research and I'm absolutely delighted because this is going to lead on to the sequel. And so I'm so happy, so satisfied. Thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Because my point was, especially with this channel, and I've said it to the other guys and stuff as well. My point was always to advertise and put Irish medieval history first and foremost. You know, I remember back in 2006 being on the onlines and the forums and stuff, and people had that depiction. When I went online, I couldn't wait to talk about Irish medieval history. I'd read, as you pointed out, the work of Sean Duffy and all this stuff, and I was so forward. Turn on the old internet, and people just have this constant idea that my ancestors had ran around naked, just flopping their penis around. We were living in mud huts, and that was that. And I was so annoyed and frustrated. So for years now, I'm on YouTube now and everything, and I'm trying to promote. That's the main purpose of the channel, is to promote Irish medieval history. That's the end goal. So I have absolutely no problems promoting your work, Bertie. You're definitely a legend amongst us.
Yeah, you're an absolute legend yourself, man. I just said it about clans and dynasties and everyone in the chat.
Well, he's a
Legends
gobshite.
for tonight.
We have to highlight that. He's a dirty
I said
Ulster
for
man,
an
you know?
Ulster, for an Ulster man, he's a bit of one. He's a bit of one.
Yeah.
But one thing on what you were saying as well is dispelling this whole political ideology. Now, without going into all of it, but just the political ideological lens and viewing history, rewriting history. The big thing is for me is that you get a lot of these people and they're looking at it through a kind of because they're really staunch about their politics, so they have to go back into into the past and rewrite the whole thing
Yeah.
or dismiss it or just trivialize it or just tear it all up and burn the books. I just think it's a travesty because if you do that, you're just cutting yourself off from who you really are as a person. We're made up of DNA. We're not made up of politics. We're made up of fucking DNA. Like, where do you think we come from? We're a part of this physical world. We're a part of this land. We're not part of political parties. It's such bullshit, like, you know. So that's why I really like your work and I really like Clans and Dynasties work, is because you really get where I'm coming from. We don't agree on absolutely everything, but we agree on a lot, the majority. And I think that's why I'm so excited, is because I've met a couple of guys now that actually are trying to preserve history, not for our own sake in the modern day, but for the sake of what it was then.
Oh, yeah.
That's the difference, I think.
Well, the thing is that we are in a period of revisionist theory because of two major things. First off, this is the first time since 1998 that we've been able to look and give our own interpretation of our own history. So you start to see the likes of Sean Duffy being pushed forward, the likes of Dr. Damien Bracken's work being pushed forward. We're starting to see our own work being pushed forward. So of course with that we see a certain level of revisionist history going undermining the old British history that came before us. And on top of that as well, we have the likes of Dr. John Sheehan and stuff getting out into the fields and stuff, digging holes, and he's finding like the lads in University College Cork, Trinity College and stuff, and even American archaeologists are coming over here, are finding so many delicious finds. As we point out there, they're finding the silk hats, they're finding the silk garments and stuff, and we can find that with the trade route going all the way over to China, which gives us a completely different interpretation of Viking Age Ireland. And we find that actually when we go look into our own history at the annals and stuff, that the history there is very, very, very complicated. But to elaborate on what you're saying, we shouldn't, and I can't highlight that enough, and I have seen documentaries that are being made right now that take it from a very modern interpretation on what happened during the early medieval period. And I definitely would have to agree, it's something that we shouldn't be doing. Is, like, don't get me wrong, when it comes down to explaining the early medieval period, then we should take it from a modern period and then trying to explain it to a
Yeah,
audience and stuff.
yeah,
But on saying that, no, we shouldn't be criticizing them the way that we would today. Let's just be honest. When it comes down to a modern perspective, all of these guys are cartels. You know, they're the most horrible human beings on the
yeah,
planet. If you look at Kevin's translation of Finn McCool, God, like Finn McCool gets romanticized when we go into the 12th century. But when these literature is being made in the 10th and 11th century about Finn McCool, he's a horrible human being. Jesus. Like, even the fact that he's in the middle of a tick for tat and he decides, do you know what? I'll murder their daughter. And he sets up an ambush and he murders her, cuts her head off, and then is kind of like an FU to the other warband. That's disgusting behaviour. No one should be involved in that. But at the same time, no, we shouldn't really be criticising him from our perspective. As we looked at Brian Boru today, technically speaking, he should have rang up the Overkings and, you know, called down the police and stuff on the men of what was it, the men of Limerick, from our modern interpretation. But you can't do that during the medieval period. He had to get involved
yeah.
with the tick for tat, which, you know, built up. So no, we shouldn't be looking at it from a modern interpretation. We should get into the literature and try to see it from their perspective.
Exactly, exactly,
So yeah, I
exactly. And
definitely
as
would
well,
have to
like,
agree on that.
and as well, from there you can disagree with certain actions. For instance, I'm not like Brian Brew, in my opinion, took a wrong action. Of course he did.
Mm,
It's not a wrong action. He did a sin, or a thing, a really terrible thing, you know.
mm,
But I'm not going to say he didn't. Of course he did.
mm,
Like, but then look at the other things that happened along the way and make up your own mind from that perspective.
mm.
You know, so that's exactly, yeah. Like, it's literally just kind of summing up what you said. But unbelievable. I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Oh
Phil,
yeah,
it
you're more
really,
than
thank you
welcome.
so much for
And
being me on.
oh,
Absolutely
definitely.
brilliant, man.
Definitely. And to be honest with you, you definitely did the research into everything because you were able to go bam, 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 bam. Like Bertie does not come from a academic field. Like I did a good few years over in the University College of Cork, and you easily, and although I did a lot of work into Murdoch Breen when I was over there, you easily today definitely rocked up and showed a whole load of information, and I can't wait to see what your sequel is. And I know there's other projects you're planning on doing with Brian Brew as well, so all these future projects and stuff, oh God, I cannot wait to see what you're up to next. And
Thanks
on
so much,
top of
man.
that as
That's
well,
brilliant.
oh, you're more than welcome. But on top of that as well, guys, we're gonna hold a big massive anniversary for the Battle of
Massive.
Clontarf over on Bertie's channel on the 23rd, so 11 o'clock Irish time. I know it's going to be even earlier for the you guys over in America, about I think it's about 5 o'clock 6 o'clock for you guys, I'm not quite sure, and then it depends which region of America you're living on. But regardless, definitely pop over to Bertie's channel. If you head over to my channel now, just go down to the very bottom, you should see Bertie's channel straight away. Go into that one, subscribe, and press, I don't know when you're going to have the live stream up, but definitely get the notification up and going for that one. And I'll see you on
Definitely.
the 23rd. So, and I'll have that link as well on
Yeah.
the post as well, guys. So I'll definitely advertise the fact that the live stream is going to be up and going for the big anniversary that's on the 23rd. So other than that, guys,
Yeah.
Bertie, I literally thank you so much. I know you said that you enjoyed yourself on that channel, but God, I really enjoyed having you over here as well. It was definitely a ton of
Amazing.
fun. And when it comes down to the topics to do with 10th century, I know you haven't read Cloud Downham's work yet on, what was it called? Omna of Cruvan. But I sent you the book as well, the link on that one. So hopefully you'll play catch up with everything else that's going on. And we can have a big old chat to do with what was it called? Viking Age Ireland in the 10th century. Next time as well that you're on, or some other time anyway. But other than that, guys, thank you so
Definitely.
much.